This is Rogers TV, Ottawa.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs, et bienvenue au Conseil municipal pour le...
Welcome to City Council for December 8th.
The 2018-2022 term of office. A warm welcome to our new colleagues around the table. Welcome, bienvenue. And I know you have some family and friends in the audience as well, and we welcome them as well. So thank you very much for coming to support your family and friends on this very important day in our city's history. For those who are able to, would you please rise for a moment of personal reflection and then remain standing for the national anthem that will be introduced in just a moment. If you could remain standing, it's my pleasure to introduce this morning's performer of O Canada, Mr. Mario Robert. C'est un plaisir d'introduire Monsieur.
Very pleased to introduce Mr. Mario Robert, who will sing the national anthem this morning.
Influenced by his mother, an accomplished piano player, and his father, a proud member of the local church choir. Les parents de jeune Mario l'ont grandement influencé à poursuivre la musique. At the age of 3, listening to vinyl records with his late grandfather, the songs of musical legends such as Luciano Pavarotti inspired a young Mario. These early influences led Mario to take up singing lessons in 2007 with Doreen Taylor Claxton, who persuaded him to take his voice to the stage and star in Orpheus musical theatre productions right here in Ottawa. Mario went on to become a tenor with Laurentian University and successfully earned a Bachelor of Arts degree with a concentration in music and history. He currently resides and performs regularly at private events while developing an online following as the Singing Bellman. And I first heard Mario at the Stars of the City celebration for the tourism industry, as he is with the tourism, the hospitality industry. So please join me on this special occasion, and my pleasure to introduce Mario Robert.
Thank you. O Canada, our home and native land, true patriot love on all of us command, car ton bras sait porter l'épée, il sait porter la croix. Ton histoire est une épopée des plus brillants exploits. God keep our land glorious and free. O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. O Canada, we stand on guard for thee.
Well, thank you very much, Mario. Big finish on O Canada. Appreciate it. It's an honor now to invite Elio Marcantonio to the podium for this Council City Builder Award presentation with your City Councillor, Jan Harder. So come on forward, Elio. J'invite maintenant Elio à monter sur le podium pour la reprise.
Elio will join us at the podium for the City Builder Award presentation.
Special and warm welcome to Elio's family who are here and friends. This award that we present at the beginning of every council meeting recognizes people who have demonstrated a commitment to making our city a better place through outstanding volunteerism and exemplary action. In 2010, Elio and his 5-year-old son Dean, who was already quite a daredevil at the time, discovered their passion for BMX racing on a track in East Ottawa. Elio knew that his Barrhaven neighborhood is a growing, family-friendly community with many kids, and that inspired him to bring BMX racing to this part of the city. The Nepean BMX Association became an incorporated non-profit organization in June 2012, and the process of building the club began. Elio credits the tremendous support he received from Councillor Jan Harder in helping the organization identify Clark Field Park location. Many hundreds of hours were spent planning and building a state-of-the-art track that has been used for the BMX Capital City Nationals in 2015, 2016, and 2018. With enthusiasm and dedication, he has been very effective at motivating and inspire others to be part of his vision. Elio gives credit to donors and supporters that supplied materials and helped fund the purchase of equipment. On June 1st, 2013, the Nepean BMX Association ran its inaugural event at Clark Field Park, and within 3 short years, it became one of the largest BMX associations in all of North America. Elio's vision was to build a BMX park that is inclusive to all families in the community, and the benefits have been far-reaching. Construction and maintenance of the track is done by volunteers, and Elio gives them much credit for continuing to help and support this project. The track promotes a healthy, active lifestyle and brings community together while also generating revenue for local businesses. Elio and the association have done an amazing job to provide much appreciated BMX track in Barrhaven. I visited the track with Councillor Harder on a number of occasions, and I'd like to thank you very, very much for your passion and your contribution to the community. J'aimerais saisir cette occasion pour remercier.
I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Elio for his contributions to the community and to the whole city.
The Mayor's City Builder Award. Keep up the great work. Come on up in here, we'll just do a little picture. Right back here. Keep your arm in there, we'll tilt it a little bit. I'll hit it in the hand. Are you going to say a few words, please? Yeah. Oops.
Thank you very much, Mayor Watson. First, I'd like to thank Eric for initiating and preparing the nomination for me. It's a great honor to accept this award today. Thank you to our volunteers and our board members who have supported me over the past 8 years. We've accomplished something that was only in my dreams 8 years ago. Thank you to Councillor Jan Harder for believing in me when I presented the idea to bring a BMX track to the Barrhaven community. You understood the benefits that a BMX track would bring to the families of Barrhaven, as well as the surrounding areas. And lastly, I'd like to thank my wife, Sarah, for your support with this project and your significant volunteer time that you put towards the organization. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much and congratulations. For the next presentation, I have the honor of proclaiming University of Ottawa GG's Women's Soccer Team Day in Ottawa, and I'm pleased to invite the following individuals to come forward. Rideau Vanier, Councillor Mathieu Fleury, where University of Ottawa is situated. Head coach Steve Johnson, assistant coaches Stuart Barber, Jean Berchon, Veronica Mazzella, and our guests of honor, the University of Ottawa GG's women's soccer team. If they'd all come forward, please, and let's give these national champions a round of applause.
Sue Island is the Director of Sports
Yeah, come on, Sue. Well, it's a real pleasure, and you saw by the response by the members of council and our audience here today how proud we are of the GG's women's soccer team. These players worked hard to get to the 2018 Youth Sports Women's Soccer Championship game, and they won it, an exciting 2-1 victory over the Trinity Western Spartans at GG Field on November 11th, winning the gold medal game. I think it's safe to say that Ottawa is building a reputation for athletic excellence right across the country. Je ne crois pas me tromper en disant.
I think it's safe to say that the U of Ottawa is building a reputation of athletic excellence right across the country.
Congratulations to the entire team. We had the honor of hosting you for breakfast upstairs and presented each member with a certificate, and we're very, very proud of your accomplishments. I'd like to ask Miranda Smith and Margot Shore to join me for the presentation, and we'll just get the proclamation here. So on behalf of my colleagues on City Council, it's my pleasure to proclaim December 5th, 2018, University of Ottawa GG's Women's Soccer Team Day, Journée de l'équipe féminine de soccer des GG's de l'Université d'Ottawa le 5 décembre. So congratulations. Come on up here, Matt. Come on in. Just move the podium.
Yep, there we go.
It's like that skit on Saturday Night Live with move the podium. So Miranda and Margot are going to offer a few comments. Over to you.
All right. So on behalf of the team, we'd like to say thank you for having us this morning and for your constant support. It's an honor to represent the university and the City of Ottawa, and our success would not have been possible without the support of everyone.
Ouais, donc on aimerait remercier le maire et son
We'd like to thank the mayor and the city administration for having us this morning. It's an honor to represent the university and the City of Ottawa. We're very proud of our winnings, and that would not have been possible without the support of everyone here. Thank you.
Well said. Bravo. Thank you. Well, congratulations again. Madam Deputy Clerk, a roll call, please.
Councillor Luloff.
And we can just push your button.
Present.
Councillor Dudas.
Ici.
Councillor Harder.
Here.
Councillor Suds.
Here.
Councillor El Shantiri.
Present.
Councillor Gower.
Here.
Councillor Kavanagh.
Present.
Councillor Shirelli.
Here.
Councillor Eglai.
Here.
Councillor Deans.
Here.
Councillor Tierney.
Present.
Conseil Fleury.
Ici.
Councillor Nussbaum.
Here.
Councillor McKenney.
Present.
Councillor Leeper.
Present.
Councillor Brockington.
Here.
Councillor Menard.
Here.
Conseil Cloutier.
Present.
Conseil Blais. Councillor DeRose.
Here.
Councillor Moffat.
Here.
Councillor Meehan.
Here.
Councillor Hubley.
Here.
Mayor Watson.
You see?
Le quorum est tien, Monsieur le maire.
You have quorum.
So the regular council meeting of November 28th, 2018, carried. Declaration of interest, including those originally arising from prior meetings. Okay. Regrets? No regrets filed. Communications as presented. Motion to introduce reports. Councillor Blais, please. Seconded by Councillor Nussbaum.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. That the report from the City Clerk and Solicitor entitled 2018-2022 Council Governance Review be received and considered, and that the rules of procedure be suspended to receive and table the report from the General Manager, Emergency and Protective Services, entitled Report on Ontario Cannabis Legislation, Cannabis Retail Stores, and Response to Council Direction of August 29, 2018, as this report will be considered by Council at this special meeting on Thursday, December 13th, 2018.
On the motion, carried. Reports, City Clerk and Solicitor, 2018-2022 Council Governance Review. We have a number of motions that have been submitted. Does anyone else have any other motions at this time? This is the time to bring forward a motion, so it gives the Clerk's office an opportunity to Councillor Kavanaugh? Okay, do you want to read it out?
Okay. Whereas during the recent municipal election, many residents voiced concern over OC Transpo operations, in particular proposed changes to OC Transpo bus routes and schedules in anticipation of the opening of the Confederation LRT, whereas all City Council is responsible for the operation of OC Transpo, its public transit provider, for which Ottawa residents contribute $285 million in taxes in 2018. Therefore, be it resolved that the terms of reference of the Transit Commission be amended so that operational issues as the fall transit schedule, winter transit schedule, and summer transit schedule be considered at the Transit Commission and recommended to the City for approval.
Okay, so that will, do you have a seconder for that? Who? Councillor Shirley. Okay, so that will fall under, I believe, under item 11, terms of reference. So we'll get that sent around to everyone. Does anyone else have another? I don't think my screen is on, Madam Deputy Clerk, so I can see who's asking or wanting to ask a question. Anyone else? You just wave at me because I can't see. Councillor Brockington, do you have? Sorry?
I just want to let you know I'm pulling one of my motions today. It's the motion regarding the OCDLC mid-term governance report. I'd like to remove that from the agenda today.
Okay, that's a good point. Thank you. Anyone else? No. Okay, so we have a roadmap that the clerk's office has presented to us, and we'll go by that. And we have, with the exception of Councillor Kavanaugh's motion that we've just added in, we have the amending motions listed. And Councillor Deans, do you have a motion on housing liaison? Okay. All right, so we have two extra motions. So that would appear, Madam Deputy Clerk, in what section? Well, when we get to the liaison positions, I think. Okay. Okay, so committee structure is part one, and we'll go through each one, and if there's no questions or comments or debate, we'll just pass it and carry on. So this is, I'll give you the report page numbers that we're dealing with. Standing committees, subcommittees, and Transit Commission, pages 22 to 53. Item 1, the Council Committee structure for 2018-2022 term of Council is outlined in this report and as follows, effective immediately. A, Agriculture and Rural Affairs Committee. B, Audit Committee. C, Community and Protective Service Committee. D, Environment and Climate Protection Committee. E, Finance and Economic Development Committee and its associated subcommittees. 1, IT Subcommittee. 2, Eliminating the Member Services Subcommittee. F, Planning Committee and its associated subcommittees, Built Heritage Subcommittee. G, Transit Commission, and H, Transportation Committee. Does anyone have any questions or comments on Section 1? Councillor El Shantiri, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Question to the clerk. I'm sad to see eliminating of the Member Service Committee, which is we never met in 2 terms so far. But what is going to be replaced with? What will be replaced? If to happen, what is the process in there?
Mr. Mayor, the process is a lot of the policies and procedures that have been put in place by this council under the accountability framework, the integrity commissioner, your expense policy, your putting things online, all of those things have largely been dealt with, including how you get a ward office. These were all things early on in the after amalgamation that committee was tasked to deal with, and I don't believe it's met since 2009.
But in the past, we had a member of councillors sit on that committee with the staff, actually specifically with the clerk, as he's the coordinator of this committee. Who will be sitting now with the staff?
Mr. Mayor, if this recommendation is approved, there won't be a committee anymore for member services, but members will be dealing directly with the clerk on all of those issues.
Good. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor. Conseiller Fleury, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Maire.
I'd like to start by thanking all of the council members and city clerk for this report. I think, generally speaking, it is a good reflection of council's needs for the governance process. I have a few questions. One of them is quite simple, but I just want it to be said in public.
To the LRT. So I'm very comfortable that the LRT planning, funding, and all of the structure has been in FEDCO. And I understand from the report that once it is operationalized, so once the LRT opens, the governance will shift to the Transit Commission. But it's unclear to me if there were to have specific questions as part of the construction, as part of some of the performances and oversight. Does that remain within the FEDCO authority, or is that carried to the Transit Commission once the LRT is open?
And once the LRT is open, Mr. Mayor, and the transition has occurred, those responsibilities for maintenance and ongoing operational issues would be with the Transit Commission as it currently stands.
And the phase 2 components or other phases would be retained in the FEDCO as per the successive or the governance approach that we've historically had.
That's correct, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, good. Thank you for clarifying. The other question I have, it's more of a point. So I've been a member of this Community and Protective Services Committee over the last 8 years. It's really one of the operational committees of council. It oversees from housing to bylaw services to emergency services to long-term care, child care. So there's a lot of variety of reports, and certainly when I met with the clerk, I did highlight that was of concern because it carries a heavy load depending on term of council priorities. So it's more of a comment that I would have loved to see. And maybe there is an opportunity to create kind of a working group style that the Planning Committee had established for the Building Better Revitalized Neighborhood, or council liaison for specific topics. So whomever plans to chair the CPS committee, I'd have some ideas on how we could structure some of those to make the committee effective.
Right. Thank you very much. Merci, Conseiller. Councillor Deans, please. We get Councillor Dean's microphone.
Light.
There we go.
Oh, okay, no, I do. Thanks, Mr. Mayor. I just wanted to ask a question on page 23 of the report. It indicates that the mayor is suggesting, in order to strengthen ties between AIRAC and Planning Committee, that the chairs of each of those committees be ex officio on the other committee. And because we don't use ex officio very often, I'm wondering why we're recommending ex officio as opposed to them just being a member of the committee, because I would think it might be a long day for somebody to sit at Planning Committee, for example, all day without having a vote. And I'm just wondering what the rationale for ex officio is.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, with regards to that, the ex officio has a particular title to it and a bit of cachet because we don't use ex officio members as part of the quorum. So therefore, if you make them regular members, they're part of the quorum. And we looked at this particular recommendation, and it arose as a result of there might be, once in a while, the Planning Committee chair may want to go to ARAC and express a more of a Planning Committee broader view. And similarly, the ARAC chair may go to Planning Committee to share some rural insights. But if we made them without the ex officio, they would actually they would be required to go to every meeting, as every committee member would, and they wouldn't have that discretion. And it also would take it out of play with regards to the size of the committee. So they can go now as, if the recommendation is carried, they would go now as ex officio members. They could move motions, they could ask questions. Sorry, and yes, they can vote.
Oh, they can vote. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Menard, please.
Thanks very much, Mr. Mayor, and through you. Just a question to staff around our planning committee structure and the Agricultural and Rural Affairs Committee. My understanding is that planning matters are referred to the Agricultural and Rural Affairs Committee if it's within the rural areas, and that there's representation of rural councillors predominantly on that committee. Can you just give me the rationale for why those planning matters are considered there and not at planning committee?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, I'll start my comments by saying it's not just planning matters. Any matters that occur largely or predominantly in the rural area are assigned to the Agricultural and Rural Affairs Committee. Staff have from time to time looked at whether or not there is something we could call a city-wide view and not have it at one committee or another, but there was no consensus on that, and the Rural Affairs Committee is a little bit different than a lot of our other standing committees. It has a freestanding mic session at the end where people can come up and make whatever comments they want. It's not located here at City Hall. It's located over at in Nepean. So there's a number of little things that that make it more or less a rather unique committee.
Thanks very much for that. I think the governance framework around the Agricultural and Rural Affairs Committee is fantastic. That should obviously continue, that it's made up of representative members elected by those folks that deal with planning matters in their area, who would have a more, I guess, fulsome view of those matters in their backyard. I think the comment's been made to me that regional representation around planning committee, given that it's our by far busiest committee and deals with a number of matters, that regional representation may be a model we wish to consider in the future. I'm not raising a motion here today, but I would appreciate comments on a potential regional representation through planning committee in the future from staff.
Well, Mr. Mayor, we'll certainly take that under advisement. I think the only thing I would have added to this at this point in time is the previous comments with regards to the ex officio member. That would draw, if there was such as a regional view, one would presume that the planning committee chair then could go to ARAC and could participate fully on those types of issues.
Thanks very much for that.
I think also, just to remind everyone, there are non-rural members that sit on ARAC as well, so it has that balance. Okay, so on item number 1, pages 22 to 42, carried. Item 2 is the membership of the following committees and subcommittees as described in this report. A, ARAC, B, Planning, C, Build Heritage. Any questions on pages 22, 24, 33, and 35 to 36? On the motion, carried. Item 3, that the terms of reference for the IT subcommittee be amended to formalize the subcommittee's budget approval process as described in this report. Les pages 29 à 30. Carried. Item 4, the elimination of the Members' Services Subcommittee as outlined in this report, and Councillor El Shantiri asked that question. Are there any other questions on the demise of that committee that has not met in years? Carried. Item 5, the terms of reference for the Build Heritage Subcommittee be revised to enable the subcommittee to make recommendations directly to City Council regarding Ontario Heritage Act reports approved by the subcommittee that do not include an accompanying zoning bylaw or official plan amendment as described in the report, pages 35 to 38. Carried. Item number 6, that the terms of reference for the Transportation Committee be revised to clarify that front-ending agreements relating to transportation matters will be considered by Planning Committee as described in this report, pages 41 to 42. Carried. Item 7, the Council, Committee, and Commission calendar, meeting locations, and other committee matters as outlined in this report, pages 42 to 45. Carried. A, that the chairs and vice chairs be appointed for the term of council, pages 45 to 46. Carried. That the nominating committee mandate and process is outlined in this report, pages 50 to 53, and we have a motion by Councillor McKenney, seconded by Councillor Brockington. Councillor McKenney, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This motion, recognizes. I think the fact that we are contemplating women's liaison, a women's bureau, recognizes that diversity in all of our decision making. If we have diversity in those voices, we make overall better decisions. And the nominating committee plays a very important function in picking the chairs, vice chairs, and the people who will certainly play a leadership role in this term of council and where we sit on different committees and councils. So it's this motion, in recognizing that, would commit us to 50% representation of women on that nominating committee. It's only one meeting, really. It's not a very long commitment, but it does play a very important role in how we move forward. So, do you want me to read it out? I think it's pretty clear what we're asking for. A copy. Yeah. Okay. Therefore, be it resolved that the nominating committee also be composed of 50% representation of women, similar, obviously, to the report recommendations for appointing 50% representation of women for advisory committees.
Great. On the motion, carried. Thank you. On the motion, on number 9 as amended. Carried. Item number 10, the ward and position-specific appointments is outlined in document 1, which is pages 50 to 53. Carried. Item number 11, that the revised terms of reference for standing committees, subcommittees, and the Transit Commission be submitted in draft form to the respective commission at their first meeting in 2019 for consideration and recommendation to Council for approval. Okay, so we have Councillor Leeper's motion. If I can get a copy of Councillor Kavanaugh's motion. So Councillor Leeper has a motion, seconded by Councillor Eglai, with respect to affordable housing mandate. Councillor Leeper, please.
Thank you, Mayor. In 2010, when the Planning and Environment Committee was split into Planning and Environment Committee, there was no recommendation in that year's governance report to include any responsibilities for affordable housing in the Planning Committee's mandate, for reasons that I suspect were largely because of the personalities' interests involved at the time. The budget for affordable housing that comes from our federal and provincial partners was put under Planning Committee. So there is an affordable housing program, a capital budget that is the responsibility of Planning Committee to approve, where the rest of our affordable housing strategy sits under the Community and Protective Services Committee. My motion would move responsibility for that capital budget associated with affordable housing over to the Community and Protective Services Committee so that it can take a holistic look at our affordable housing initiatives. Quite frankly, within the Planning Committee budget, every year that one affordable housing item comes before us, we hear some delegations from housing advocates and then generally just rubber stamp the budget. I think it's going to be a richer discussion with respect to affordable housing to have all of the tools under the Community and Protective Services. Mr. Mayor, if I can just read the therefore be it resolved perhaps. Therefore be it resolved that the terms of reference for the Community and Protective Services Committee reflect the responsibility for the city's affordable housing strategy and all related housing policy initiatives, including development and policies related to the city's official plan.
Okay, question and comments, Conseiller Fleury, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Maire.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you, Councillor Leeper, for bringing this motion forward. This is not always an easy subject. what the urbanism committee studies is quite complicated. The Community Services and Protection Committee did approve a 10-year plan for housing. The policy and investment, as well as operational issues, are the responsibility of the Community and Protection Committee, but investments that are needed to achieve those goals, if our would be met if our Director General were in both committees. I know that Mr. Willis is currently looking at inclusive zonage, which is also a very important issue. This is a problem we had with the former committee. We had 9 projects approved, and they're excellent projects, including supportive housing. And the committees looking at the goals of the project had no authority for official review. So I'm going to support the motion. It's quite simple. It doesn't mean, of course, that the planning committee ceases to be responsible for housing, but the committee and that should be looking at that budget is the Community and Protective Services Committee.
Planning Environment Committee. The thought initially was to... Am I not on? Oh, sorry. Usually I talk loud enough you don't even need it. I'm losing my touch. Okay, so when the decision was made to split the Planning Environment Committee into the Planning and then the Environment Committee, and some opportunities for change happened at that time, initially the consideration was to keep all of affordable housing in the Planning Committee. And but at that time it was decided, you know what, the people part of it, the policy for the people, et cetera, was a better fit with Community and Protective Services, and that's why that was. But as far as housing itself and its construction, et cetera, it really is a planning function. And the capital and the site plan and or rezoning and all sits with one committee. And you marry that with the fact of the influence of the DCs, and we're going through the DC, new DC bylaw in this term, and in fact this first year, and it's absolutely clear that that should all be together so we can look at it holistically and make the changes that we want across the board for affordable housing in this case. And so it makes sense to have that funding and construction in one place. It also is Section 37, inclusionary zoning will not be at Community and Protective Services. Inclusionary zoning will be at Planning Committee. So there's other mechanisms as well that impact the actual building of the property, and it makes a lot of sense to keep the capital in the Planning Committee. That's why the decision was made that way at the time, and I see no reason to change it.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Aguilar, please.
Mr. Mayor, this will be a question for the clerk. Mr. Clerk, just so I'm seconding this motion, so obviously I'm in favor of, but just for clarification for everyone around the table, this motion does not take away Planning Committee's right and authority to make the zoning decisions around where something might be built, what height it might be, all those sorts of things. That still remains with the Planning Committee, correct?
That's correct, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you for that clarification.
Councillor McKenney, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Another question to staff. If I'm not mistaken, when environment was taken out of planning, at that point, the terms of reference changed for the planning department and brought the capital piece of housing over there. Am I not correct? Housing, the full housing bucket never existed under planning. It was actually moved over there when environment was taken out of planning and environment. Is that not correct? Mm-hmm. I wrote the terms of reference. I remember writing the terms of reference, so I could go back into my email and look for that.
That may be why no staff knows except for the former staff member. Mr. Mayor, we'll get back to you right on that.
Okay. I am correct, though. I just want to put that out there before we vote. I remember.
Okay.
So it did all fall within the housing CPSC bucket. It got moved over. The capital piece got moved over when we took environment out of planning and environment.
Councillor Luloff, please.
Can we have a recorded vote on this motion?
Yeah, we will. Thank you. Okay, any other questions? Councillor Kavanaugh or comments?
I just want to show my support for this in terms of the affordable housing. And I guess I can ask staff what other factors are involved in the affordable housing strategy in terms of this committee, in terms of what specifically they can do on this.
Okay. Councillor Leeper.
Thanks, Mayor. So just to wrap that up, I also consider it important the staff who are largely responsible for dealing with the investment in affordable housing dollars are in our housing branch, and I think it's important that they have sort of one committee through which to report. We also see that housing advocates really they're required to come to two different committee meetings. They're advocating for housing measures at CPSC, and then they're coming to Planning Committee for this one kind of anomaly within our larger budget. So I am hoping to get your support on this today to make it a little bit clearer for everybody.
Councillor Deans.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just wanted to point out that if we do make housing whole again, which makes sense to me, that in the event that we're talking about inclusionary zoning or issues that obviously have connections to the Planning Committee, there is nothing to prevent us from having a joint meeting between CPS and the Planning Committee to address those issues. That's all I wanted to say.
Councillor Blais.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I guess I just would like some feedback from Mr. Willis, since it is his responsibility after all. Why, or what is your view on maintaining the status quo as presented in the report versus a change?
Mr. Mayor, just in response to Councillor Blais' question, I mean, the department supports the intent behind the motion, but the motion as written actually we fear complicates a number of very major files that the department has to move in the next term of council. The official plan, inclusionary zoning, every development charges decision, every Section 37 decision related to housing, if affordable housing is a tool, it's not clear from the motion as written which committee has jurisdiction over it. Forecasts on housing supply, which we're required to provide to Planning Committee right now to meet provincially mandated requirements and reporting on that. Development monitoring on the housing supply, which we're required to do provincially mandated. So with committee cycles and the like, there has to be a way to involve councillors of interest, but I fear that we have a very large number of files that will have, it's not clear which committee they would go through the way the motion's written at this point in time.
Well, thank you very much for that, Mr. Willis. And I think we can all agree, Mr. Mayor, that this is going to be a term of council full of long-term planning, whether it's the official plan, the transportation master plan, the recreation plan, a housing plan. And to have our professional staff say that something we are contemplate doing on the first day will perhaps negatively affect all of that planning and lead to a lack of clarity on how to do those plans, I think is very troubling. And as a result, I can't support this motion.
Thank you. Councillor Menard, please. And Councillor Fleur, you've spoken already, so you should have asked it at the time.
It's on this one. Oh, so thanks very much, Mr. Mayor.
You have one chance for question and comments, so the rules are in the standing order. Councillor Menard.
Thanks very much, Mr. Mayor. And so just a question to staff, because being new to this, the items that you just mentioned, Mr. Willis, what was the process before it was in Planning Committee? How did it exist previously and work in that way amongst all of those items?
Mr. Mayor, I'm going to have to ask Mr. O'Connor to help, as you know, my tenure here doesn't predate that.
Okay.
Tim Marks.
Mr. Mayor, Mr. Mark is making his way to the table now.
Mr. Mayor, the circumstances have changed since than what was the situation in past councils. As others have referenced at this council, there are additional tools that have been made available to the city with legislation over the years. A significant, well, there's two. Section 37 wasn't used by council in past years. It was a tool that was available but was not employed. It is now employed, and it is within the realm of Planning Committee to employ it. The other major tool which staff are working on is, of course, inclusionary zoning. That is a tool that has recently been made available by legislation. The planning staff are working on the implementing mechanisms to make it available, and again, that rests with Planning Committee. So the situation has changed since past years.
Okay, thank you. Anything else, Councillor?
No, that's helpful. I guess, you know, with regard to this motion, to me, having something where it's comprehensive, where you're dealing with both the operational and capital in the same time, given how important housing is going to be to this term, I guess I would ask staff, if this motion were to pass, how would you implement it so that we are able to feasibly you know, produce the results that we're talking about here in this motion? What would you do in order to enable this decision to happen?
Mr. Mayor, staff will do as council directs, first and foremost. Council, we'll take any direction council gives us on this. The concern I raise is the lack of clarity on a number of issues, that this motion as written is extremely broad. And if council votes in favor of the motion, we will bring all of these different reports that I listed, the official plan reports related to housing, inclusionary zoning, development charges issues related to where they are related to affordable housing, any Section 37 agreement that relates to affordable housing, forecasts and reporting on housing supply, development monitoring will all have to be reported to both committees in cycle, which as you can appreciate, our concern is that's a doubling of effort. It's confusing to the public which committee they're coming to, and it would lengthen the cycle to get these matters before council for a final decision. But we will do as council directs. We are concerned about all the doubling of effort and what the lack of clarity that will be to both staff and to the public.
Yeah, and just to be clear on that, you would take doubling of reports to both committees on every single item, or would it be based on the item for affordable housing, let's say on capital, that would go to CPSC versus planning in that regard?
Mr. Mayor, the motion as written right now would require us to take any issue from a policy perspective or a financial perspective to both effectively. That's the way the motion is, as I read it today, and I welcome to be corrected on that, but that's our reading of what we would have to do.
Okay, it would be worthwhile to get clarification from the mover on that then. Thank you.
Councillor Fleury has an amendment.
Yes, Mr. Mayor. So, Mr. Willis, your point's well taken. When you read the therefore be resolved, it is wide-ranging. So, I'm proposing a friendly amendment. I'll read the revised therefore be it resolved. So, therefore be it resolved that the term of reference for the community protective services reflect the responsibility for the city's affordable housing strategy, and this is the addition, for capital budgets associated with affordable housing. So, we're only speaking of the amount of money of investments for affordable housing that the city has done, city and other levels of government, that be held within CPS. So that clarifies, and that doesn't get us caught in the broader policies and the duplication of reports and so on.
So to Mr. Willis, does that change your concerns?
Mr. Mayor, I'm going to need Ms. Burrell's input on this, because at this extent, that does narrow it down to Ms. Burrell's world.
So absolutely, what we bring to planning is essentially the budget, the capital budget at budget time, as well as the operating. And then anytime we get substantial funding from the federal and provincial government is when we go to planning and talk about the investments and the recommendations therefore. So we can certainly, typically what we will do is bring it to CPS as well. So I think that if the narrow scope as suggested is certainly workable, but in terms of the other responsibilities as it relates to planning, things like inclusionary zoning, transit-oriented development, and the more mixed use we do, I do see a very heavy link and absolutely more work that we're doing with planning every day. So it's something that we have to consider absolutely going forward.
Okay, Councillor DeRuse, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, through you to staff, I guess. With this implementation of this motion and the changes that's going to happen, how much staff time is going to take? And is this going to impact any project right now that we're already moving forward? The city is moving forward with them. That's how this is going to come and take place from your perspective.
Mr. Mayor, if the motion is amended as Councillor Fleury has suggested, it does narrow the impact considerably. And as Ms. Burrell indicated, and she can speak and add to points, we would likely have carried those reports to both committees regardless because of their impact. And certainly council at any kind of time can direct us to take for information to another committee should that be necessary through direction. So with Councillor Fleury's motion, that does narrow the impact quite a bit. Councillor Fleury's amendment, forgive me.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, so Councillor Leeper, you're taking this as a friendly amendment, so we'll just add it on. Okay, anyone else wish to speak on this item? No. I'd urge members of council not to support this. We heard from our staff that there are a number of issues that rightfully belong with the Planning Committee. We're going to be dealing with inclusionary zoning, a DC bylaw review, official plan, transit-oriented development, and the placement of affordable housing near transit stations, which is a planning responsibility, the TMP, and so on. And we've heard from the chair planning in the last term of council that the system that we had in place is working well. I don't like the idea of joint committees. It just adds to the burden of all of your schedules and to the staff that have to prepare twice the number of committees in 1 month. So I'd urge you to vote no on this, and we've been, yeas and nays have been called, Madam Deputy Clerk.
Councillor Eglai.
Yes.
Councillor Suds. No. Councillor Dudas. No. Councillor El Shantiri.
No.
Councillor Blais.
No.
Councillor Moffat.
No.
Councillor Shirelli.
Yes.
Councillor McKenney.
Yes.
Councillor Harder.
No.
Conseil Cloutier.
No.
Councillor Luloff.
No.
Councillor Menard.
Yes.
Conseil Fleury. Oui. Councillor Hubley.
No.
Councillor Tierney.
No.
Councillor Nussbaum.
Yes.
Councillor DeRuse.
No.
Councillor Deans.
Yes.
Councillor Gower.
No.
Councillor Meehan.
Yes.
Councillor Kavanagh.
Yes.
Councillor Brockington.
No.
Councillor Leeper.
Yes.
Mayor Watson.
No.
10 yeas, 14 nays.
Okay, so that's defeated. Next is a motion by Councillor Kavanagh, seconded by Councillor Shirelli. Councillor Kavanagh, if you'd introduce your motion, please.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. During the recent campaign, getting elected, I heard a lot about bus routes. People are thrilled with LRT coming, but it's a long ways off in Bay Ward. One of their top concerns was what they felt was an arbitrary cut to a route that was well used and well thought of. And it was obvious that there was concerns in terms of how these decisions were made when route number 11 was cut. We have a substantial budget, and one of the things that we do is update service during the different sessions, the fall, the winter, and the summer. And we take into consideration the workability. But one route that was particularly that I noticed was number 11 was cut. That was a well-used service, and it just seems there was a disconnect. And as I talked to individuals across the ward, I heard about it, and it was clear that that we need more input to have these routes work. This is something that wasn't broken and it was taken away from people, causing substantial problems for those, especially seniors, and those with limited disabilities, with disabilities, pardon me. So I ask for the support for this motion. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Manconi, could you give us a comment on councillors dealing with operational issues, please?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And perhaps what I'll describe is how the current system works. It's as we adjust the network 4 times a year. And the way the structure is set up, it enables councillors, those of you, because you know your communities better than we do, to consult with staff and make adjustments leading up to those quarterly adjustments and also in between those adjustments. And so, you know, recent evidence of that is Councillor Harder in her ward, Councillor Fleury in his ward, and last night we met with a group from the Vanier group that wants some adjustments on those routes. The golden rule is, of course, we work within existing resources, and what the current system does is it enables the ward councillors to request adjustments and to work with the community and to implement those adjustments. The motion that's before you for consideration would, in essence, eliminate that flexibility. You'd bring it to a citywide discussion, so your route would be up against other wards in terms of discussions. It would severely protract the timelines, and to be candid and blunt, basically you'd be stuck on 4 adjustment periods and virtually no adjustments in between. I've already met with some councillor-elects. We're working on some solutions there, and I'd be happy to work with Councillor Kavanagh on the Route 11. The other recent examples I point to is there was some adjustments made with the LRT that several councillors were not satisfied with. We quickly implemented those changes. If we did not have that delegated authority, we would have had to bring a report to council, to committee, then rise to council, and we wouldn't even be near implementing those routes. So we wrap the service around the single most important thing, and that's the customer. You own the service, you own the interaction with your communities, you know them better than we do, and so the flexibility that currently is in place, we think is in best interest of everyone. This motion would restrict us severely, and again, to be candid, I think the councillors would be stuck in a process where you do not have the flexibility to make adjustments.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Harder, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor, and I understand the motivation, Councillor Kavanagh, for bringing that forward, but I would go look at Councillor Deans and recall when she was the chair of transit, and when we had a nightmare situation with routes, there was major route changes, etc. at that time. Nobody knows your ward like you do. No one knows Barrhaven like I do. I have 60,000 people. It has been the #1 issue for me in this term. And Councillor Leeper will recall back in February when he came out to Barrhaven for a very well-attended meeting. And then we had follow-up in April, and OC Transpo was invited. And over the year, it's been quite a public process of what's been happening, not because I have invited the media in, but it's been important that they be there because the public has been in so much angst about how they're able to leave their community and get back to their community. We are far away, okay? Without the help that I've had from Mr. Manconi and his team working within what was already available in Barrhaven and being able to MacGyver that, if you will, I would not be having the changes. It is far from perfect. Okay? There are snow days when it's still awful. There are still full buses that are passing people by. But I don't want to get involved with what Councillor Dudas and Councillor Luloff are doing in their neck of the woods. I don't know their people. I'm not talking to them. I'm not receiving the phone calls. I'm not receiving the emails. I'm not having people confront me in every single place that they possibly can, whether it's Minto Rec, Walter Baker, the Ruthie Dickinson, or any store in Barrhaven, or on a bus when I'm there, when I'm on the bus, about them. They know what their needs are going to be and how to best help their people working with our senior management. So with all due respect, I suggest you do not support this, that you continue to work with the management. They're always going to try their very best to come up with solutions. The only time I've had a crossover situation was a person who lives in Councillor McKenney's ward, who, as you know, it's about when the LRT opens and changing that route will go back to what it was that goes to the RCMP. So other than that, take care of your own backyard. Work hard with OC Transpo. They really do have your residents' best interests at heart. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Councillor Cloutier, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Maire. Et puis,
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd like to support what Councillor Harder just said. It becomes absolutely unbearable if those operational decisions were made by the planning or by the transit committee. They would become very politicized. I'd like to ask Mr. Manconi whether other large cities in Canada, in his opinion, in other large cities in Canada, I should say, do the public transit committees have operational responsibilities within their mandate? I think no, but in some cities like Toronto, and in Toronto, for example, there's the Ottawa Transit Rider Group that's been started up. I had a meeting with that group yesterday, and I told them what I'm saying today. Dialogue can be used to make changes, but the most important thing is for the ward councillor to be engaged in that dialogue. So with a dialogue with the community, things can be changed. In my view, Toronto is set up much like we are and has the same approach, but I can find out. I agree with the notion that dialogue with community groups and wards are crucial in dealing with problems and difficulties that arise with one route or another. I can say from experience that dealing with OC Transpo and their people are always engaged in with the aim of helping people. Like Councillor Harder, I don't think that this motion by Councillor Kavanagh should be supported.
Deans, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Well, let me just start by saying that I certainly understand Councillor Kavanagh's motivation for this motion, because we all heard plenty during the election and since the election about transit routes and the frustration that the public have with those. But as Councillor Harder correctly pointed out, I mean, I saw firsthand the impact of horse trading that goes on when we're seized with those operational issues, and what it led to, and we had to resolve that 8 years ago now, was a lot of inefficient transit routes, ones that really were carrying a lot of buses that were pretty empty and not the most efficient because the routes were horse traded. I think for me, the issue is making sure that we have enough funds in our transit budget to provide the quality service across the city that we all need and that our electors, our residents expect. But for us to get into that level of detail and setting the routes really ends, we don't ever cut an inefficient route that way. Everything goes. That's what we saw in the past. And for that reason, I'm not going to support this motion.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Brockington, please.
Thank you, Your Worship, and good morning to everyone. First of all, I'm not going to speak at length about why I'm not supportive of this motion, but I want to say I agree with the sentiment, and I'm looking for a greater ability to impact change as well, because I think that's what Councillor Kavanagh is looking for. And it's challenging not being on the Transit Commission to have the ability to impact change, because obviously you're looking out for the interests of your own ward, but trying to make citywide decisions. And so, Mr. Manconi, I just want to ask you, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but ultimately what I want is a better ability to impact change, keeping in the whole city context? Is there a way that I don't get quarterly meetings with OC Transpo Brass? I mean, you and I had an appointment today at 11:30. We're probably not going to make that today, but Mr. Scrimger, your assistant, deals with a lot of issues in my ward. He's very good, but sometimes I get sort of the standard response. So how can councillors get effective change within their communities? We keep hearing about Barrhaven issues. OC Transpo has significant challenges as well trying to meet those needs, but I think that's what we're trying to look for, is a better balance when chronic issues in wards continue to persist year after year after year. What is the best way to address and deal with those issues?
Councillor, you do exactly what you've done. You've reached out to me. You've asked for a meeting. We're supposed to meet today, and I'm bringing you some good news on some of your chronic issues. It's going to take some time, but we have a plan to address one of your chronic issues. And it's the proof of concept that I just talked about, that once we know the level of detail, other than as you know, I like the meeting yesterday we had with the Auto Transit Group. One of the speakers said it well. Is it a perceived problem or is it a real problem? Once we have the facts, and sometimes it takes time to get the facts, and sometimes it takes the ward councillor to do some things. Councillor Harder unlocked some issues for us on some areas where we couldn't run buses, and again, because she knows the ward. I do have an update on your issue, and it's because you've brought the facts to us. We were able to do that deep dive. Mr. Scrimger's done the analysis, and if we have our meeting today or tomorrow, to me, it's very straightforward. It's that you ask us, you bring us the problems. Councillor Deans has flagged some issues for me. I'm doing a deep dive on that one also, and once we know of the real issues, we can look at that and bring those things to you, not cast in stones, and you can have the dialogue with your community.
Okay. Councillor McKenney, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I do want to also start by thanking Councillor Kavanagh for raising this. There probably isn't a day that goes by that I don't get an email from a frustrated transit rider, and at this point, we're in a tougher position. We're waiting for LRT to open. Things will change, but I think that Councillor Deans articulated it best. The issue is that if we don't have the service, it's not because I should be taking it from somewhere else. It's because we don't have the resources. We're dealing with too small of a bucket. So I'm not going to support the motion. I certainly would not want to put any of us, myself especially, in a position where I am fighting for someone else's resources because I don't want a route in the ward that serves residents that I represent truncated. And I think, if we look back at the number 11, when that route was changed, and we came out and we asked for a reinstatement. We got a minor one, but again, my concern when we throw it all on the table, and it's citywide, and as Councillor Harder pointed out, most of our routes affect our residents. So it would be, my concern is that we would be fighting over routes that don't affect our residents, so that we keep our preferred routes, but that the very neighborhoods who often need better transit could be the losers, the ones who don't have the resources for the strong advocacy, the ones whose residents, perhaps if they're lower income, aren't able to come out and voice their concerns in the same way as other neighborhoods, could be the and are often the ones left out of those broader decisions. So I wanted to go on record as to why I'm not able to support this motion today, so that we can move forward. But I do want to make one last comment, and that is that, when we hear it's about resources, you know, in this upcoming budget, I expect from every department to understand and to be, you know, to be given the information we need on what the resources are to meet the needs of residents. So if it is underfunding, I want to hear that, and I think that that's the conversation that needs to happen. Not so much one route versus the other, but you know, how much more money do we put in transit services or housing or recreation if in fact that is the issue. Thank you.
Councillor Dudas, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I want to thank my council colleague for bringing this forward. As many of us have mentioned, this is a top-of-mind issue for our residents. I will say that I will not be in favor of this motion because I'm not in favor of anything that politicizes an operational procedure. And I have to say that, you know, after being elected, I had the opportunity to speak with Mr. Manconi and Mr. Scrimmager and many of their staff, and they were quite forward-thinking. I'm a little nervous. and, you know, they were very open about what their decisions and how, you know, ward decisions can impact the larger scale and the city as a whole in terms of the operations. And I'm concerned that by making it a political decision as opposed to an operational decision, we will lose sight of the fact that on a ward-by-ward basis, we are going to be working on behalf of our residents, but we may be losing that bigger picture that we're pulling services from other very areas that are in need of that. So I just wanted to be on the record as to why I will not be supporting this, although I do appreciate the intent behind it.
Thank you, Councillor Dudas. Councillor Kavanaugh, I understand you wish to withdraw your motion.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yes.
Okay, you can't speak on it a second time, but you can withdraw it.
I can't speak to say why?
Well, if you be very, very brief, please,
okay.
Because each person has one term.
Okay, I just want to thank my colleagues. It's clear this will not pass, but hopefully we can review it in the future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so we have item 11, non-amended. Carried? Item section B, advisory committees. Item 1, pages 54 to 60, the establishment of the following advisory committees as listed. Councillor Fleury, I have a motion, but I don't have a seconder. Rick Shirelli. So that's the odd couple. All right, so Councillor Fleury, if you want to introduce your motion, and this is your chance to ask questions or comment all in one.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll start. 8 years ago, there was a review of the entire advisory committee structure. There's been some changes that are very effective. I've been the liaison for the Culture and Recreation Advisory Committee for some time, and I've noticed that members of our community sitting on more formal committees and some of the rules and regulations, they're not familiar with them. So what I'm trying to do is keep the same structure, but pilot for one of the advisory committees a structure where the same reporting mechanisms would be in place, the same consultation would be in place. Obviously, we would ask that staff that presented that committee come as early as possible before there's a draft report for early input. But fundamentally that we would allow for the committee more of a cafe-style discussion on the staff proposal, and that if appropriate, that the location could be moved. I'll give you an example. Over the last term, when the Ottawa Art Gallery opened, Alex Badzak came to present to committee. It would have been great if committee was able to move their meeting into the new art gallery and at the same time do a tour. So those are the sort of this sort of pilot that I'm looking forward to. I'll read the therefore be it resolved that staff be directed to examine options within the existing government framework and budgets for improving the ability for advisory committee members to provide input in decision making, including but not limited to providing additional flexibility within the within and outside of the advisory committee rules and procedure to eliminate any barriers to participation and feedback, having advisory committee meet in the community rather than at City Hall when relevant to the agenda item or project under discussion, and providing additional guidance to staff on the requirements for bringing forward items to the advisory committee in a timely manner, and that requirements for providing on that feedback and requirements for reporting on the feedback received, and be it further resolved that these administrative process improvements be piloted with the Arts, Culture, and Recreation Advisory Committee, and that staff be directed to report back as part of the 2018-2022 midterm governance review.
Now, I see a number of people wish to speak to this. I think there's probably a degree of support for this, so I'm not sure if we need a long debate. Councillor Chiarelli.
Okay, thank you, Your Worship. Not only am I seconding this, I'm going to vote for it. Okay. I think this particular committee especially is the right one to choose to pilot this, because it's the one that needs to be most agile, yet at the same time relaxed. And I think this committee will probably appreciate it more than others. And if it doesn't work there, we're not going to try it anywhere else, obviously.
Councillor El-Shantiri.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and I'm looking forward to see Councillor Chiarelli and some of those advisory committee. My question is to the staff, the cost of moving meeting, because I know we have a legislative to stay in the city for recording, for translation, for other. Moving a meeting outside the city hall, what will be the cost of this?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, I'm going to have the Deputy Clerk who oversees the advisory committees respond.
Madam Deputy Clerk.
Mr. Mayor, what is being proposed is not, as I understand the motion, a suggestion that all of the meetings of the advisory committee would be moved off-site to non-city facilities, but rather we would work within our existing budget envelope to, on a case-by-case basis, if there was an issue pertaining to a particular location, to move that meeting to that location, minimizing the cost and accommodating within our existing advisory committee budget.
And we will be reviewing this in the midterm government to see the extra cost?
Yes, Mr. Mayor.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so on the motion, carried. On the item as amended, carried. Item 2, the renewal of the current public members' appointments to the Planning Advisory Committee for 2018-2022, carried. Item 3, that advisory committee council liaisons be appointed by the relevant standing committees as outlined in this report, carried. Item 4, that the following measures be implemented to address the requirements from Bill 175, the Safer Ontario Act, that the GM of Emergency and Protective Services be directed to draft a community safety and well-being plan and to bring forward to CPS and council a report regarding the work plan for developing the community safety and well-being plan no later than Q4 2019 as outlined in this report, and that the terms of reference for Crime Prevention Ottawa be amended to provide CPO with the responsibility to establish an advisory committee to be designated the city's Community Safety and Well-being Advisory Committee for the purposes of Bill 175 by Q2 2019 as outlined in this report. Carried. Item C, other standing committee changes and updates. Support budget process is outlined in this report. We have 3 amendments. Councillor Nussbaum, who's seconding your motion? Rick Chiarelli?
I think
Might support it.
Councillor Meehan is seconding the motion, not Councillor Chiarelli. Sorry, Rick.
Okay, so if you want to introduce your motion, please.
Yes, absolutely, Mr. Mayor. And I want to start by thanking staff. The issue that I am identifying today is a recommendation from staff in the governance report on page 68 to change slightly the way in which the budget process operates. And in fairness to staff, I suspect they are doing so because they must have heard from a number of councillors who were perhaps dissatisfied with the way the budget process worked over the last term of council. And so I thank them for giving it an excellent try. That said, I don't think it's quite right the way it's proposed in the report. And just to explain, what the report recommends right now is in a standing committee context, whereas in the previous term of council, the standing committee was restricted to proposing any increases in its budget. It had
had to find offsets within its own budget. What the proposal is on page 68 is that a standing committee, if it wished to increase its budget, would be allowed to identify offsets in other standing committee budgets. So to give an example, if at CPSC committee we heard from dozens of delegations that stressed the importance of fire prevention and the need for greater fire service resources, and the committee said, okay, we're going to recommend another fire truck in order to finance that, they could go into the transportation budget and say we're taking that from snow plowing or any other committee offset. And of course, if CPSC is meeting last, then there would be no opportunity for members of the Transportation Committee or others to perhaps challenge that or question it. And so, again, while I think the goal was increased flexibility, my fear is it would result in a little bit of chaos in terms of committees poaching from one another in ways that maybe aren't as transparent and aren't as clear to the public as they ought to be. That said, the purpose behind it, I think, is valid. And the issue here is that standing committees do often hear from many, many members of the public. So you could often get dozens of people coming out to speak to a certain issue, and under the previous rules, the Standing Committee had no formal way of communicating to Committee of the Whole that there might be a particular budget pressure. And so while I think the goal should always be for Standing Committees to find ways of solving budget pressures within their own budget, it certainly has occurred, and I can imagine it could occur, that committee members are not necessarily in a position to identify the best offsets. And one of the things that we're blessed with is a professional staff who know the departments very, very well. And I think it's often their place and their best place, and we should take their advice on where these kinds of offsets should be found if a standing committee or ultimately Committee of the Whole feels that there needs to be an adjustment in a particular budget. So in place of what staff have put forward, what I'm suggesting is that in a case, let's use the fire truck example again, CPSC feels it needs another fire truck or the city needs another fire truck. It doesn't feel confident identifying offsets. What could happen in that case is they simply identify through the motion that goes to Committee of the Whole that they've identified a fire truck as a budget pressure. In the intervening period between CPSC and Committee of the Whole, staff would be asked then to say, well, if you want another fire truck, here are the various options, reserves, reallocation, offsets, increased resource requirements, other levels of government, etc. So it gives a little bit of rigor to the process. It gives staff an opportunity to provide advice to Committee of the Whole on options should Committee of the Whole choose to respond to that budget pressure. But of course, Committee of the Whole can ultimately also say, sorry, we don't think the city does need another fire truck, and that financial pressure would not be accepted. So it's a slightly different process than what's put forward on page 68. I think it's more transparent. I think it gives greater flexibility to committees without raiding other committees' budgets. And I think it is important as a responsive way to listen to the public delegations and make sure it has the flexibility to at least recommend changes without offsets that it may not be in a position to identify. So that's the explanation for the motion.
Right, thank you. Councillor Shirelli, please.
Thank you, Your Worship. I want to begin by first moving an amendment seconded by Councillor Kavanagh, and she knows about it. Prior to, basically to strike from the word prior onward in the be it further resolved section. Okay.
Sorry, can you speak a little louder, Councillor?
Okay, in the be it further resolved section, from the word prior onward, strike that. Okay, that is the motion. And, okay, if they could scroll up, because you can't actually see what I'm striking. Scroll down then, if further. Okay. Can you see it? Okay. So, to strike that. So, first of all, I want to support the motion. I understand that technically, under the current system, you could technically do this, but in practice, it's not likely, any change is not likely to pass, and we've got ample evidence of that over the last 8 years. So if there are serious changes that need to be made, that need to cross envelopes, then this motion by the councillor will do that. Also, what it does is it says if the committee has exhausted its envelope but needs, in the example here, an extra fire truck or proposes we need one, it identifies that as a pressure that goes to Committee of the Whole and allows Committee of the Whole to either approve or not approve proposed reduction in another envelope's area. But it also allows that period of several days between the committee meeting and the Committee of the Whole meeting for members to speak with staff to find out the funding sources, for example, of the things that you might propose to cut. They may not be those that actually have the same net impact on the bottom line. They also provide the opportunity for staff or members of council to gather around and see what makes more sense or whether the proposal would actually make sense. And it lets those decisions happen in the open, in a transparent way for the public to see. So if there's a proposal, for example, to add a fire truck, which is in one envelope, and take out, I don't know, a decorative structure at a transit station that's in another envelope, then it lets Committee of the Whole make that decision and set that priority. But by adding this amendment, it doesn't just fluff it off onto staff to come up with a setting of priorities. It leaves us to set the priorities because we were the ones elected to set the priorities. And I think doing it this way, the public will be able to see how we actually are setting priorities, and they'll be able to see what choices are actually being made. And it will be something that is actually possible and not just technically possible.
Councillor El Shantiri.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm going to ask a couple of questions, but then I will encourage my colleague not to support either the amendment or the motion. Mr. O'Connor, in the past, each committee will take care of their budget. If there's an increase or decrease, we have to find it within that budget. Am I correct?
That's correct, Mr. Mayor.
And the recommended change today will be you can recommend some changes, but you have to bring the changes to the committee as a whole. Is that what's been recommended?
Yes, that an individual standing committee could take money or from another budget of another standing committee and bring it to the Committee of the Whole. Correct.
And if we go back to the old process, one person would dig the hole, the other one would fill it up, and that's how we used to do before. We spent 3 days doing budget motion with Jan Harder, Brian Aspizza, and then next thing you know, the other group of council put back all the money we saved. So, and this way, we tried to avoid that by going to another way. So you're responsible for your own committee and your own spending and your own increase versus putting your hand in someone else's pocket. So, Mr. Mayor, I've seen the attempt to make the changes, but quite honestly, I think that will be a step backward to the way it was before, which is really did not work for us, and that's why we come back to this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Harder, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I'm just going to start off with Transportation Committee. I think that as things currently stand, we usually get 1 or 2 intersections done in the city a year, okay? There's going to be, unless we change things, unless the recommendation comes back, we're going to be still about $2 million or something in the budget for all the intersections. I forget how many, I think there's 50 on the list, okay? We have one at Barnsdale and Prince of Wales that there's others that are priorities, but they have had accident records of 3. This one has 30. In my mind, just because of the safety issue alone and that many accidents, there should be a mechanism that allows us to do that. And I mentioned that to Mr. Kanellakis. So say in transportation, all of us come forward and we say, we want those 50 funded. That's going to mean an amount of money, okay? If you want to make a decision on transportation, then you're going to have to make the decision today based on what else is in that envelope. And that's okay, okay? And the reason it's okay is because we set policy, we set a guideline for budget, and these people work really, really hard to implement and to use their best advice in guiding us through where we have positions of, you know, where it's your turn to have a crossing guard and the warrants have been achieved and all of those things that happen and that are funded through the budget. I don't want to put them in a position to win or lose the popularity contest, quite frankly, okay? Based on the fact that maybe 6 of us get together and overburden, and tell them this is what you need to do. And then you have Carol Ann, for example, who's been waiting for a crossing, a pedestrian crossing or whatever, to lose that in the popularity battle, okay? I think that the decisions, the way that we have our system that works within the structures of the standing committees, and it's not going to be that easy for all the new people because you don't have the history that some of the rest of us do. But you're going to have to trust us to say that when you come with a recommendation that they're forced to give that says we're going to close 8 branches or 9 branches of the Ottawa Public Library, and you cause Rainer Blois, who now Laura's sitting in the chair, to dump 25,000 postcards from Blackburn Hamlet on why Blackburn Hamlet should not be closed, and you go on for 3 weeks of the budget process because you had a group of people, many groups of people, many individuals, hundreds in fact, that would come out and plead for that plea bargain. The system we have is an effective system. You know, I'll give you an example on a personal level. You didn't hear me coming and saying, and I should have, because in Barrhaven, with the pressure and the population and the safety issues that we have with the tracks and everything else, I could put forward a very good argument as to why I should steal from somebody else in this city, okay? My job is to make the best decision I can with what I have. So I had to make a decision to take $80 million from the Greenbank realignment to spend it on Strandherd instead, which will have an overpass and address one of those safety issues. And it is a project that right now, Strandherd, which is the new Hunt Club, which is the third 417, is a ring road that a full third of it is a 2-lane rural road with ditches. That was the decision that I had to make based on representing my folks. What would that have done to all of your projects if I'd been able to just pop in and grab because Mr. Manconi's staff said, well, here's our best advice. You've tasked us with this. We've already given you our best advice. Remember that. When they put the budget forward, there's room for movement. They're reflecting from their best knowledge and taking into account our best directions to come forward with something that they feel will represent and serve our public very well, our citizenry very well. So to ask them to go back and then make other choices, be careful what you ask for, because it could be your library that's on the chopping block, and I'm telling you, that's not pretty to see that happen. 2004 was a nightmare. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Good history lesson there.
Une bonne leçon de l'histoire. Le conseiller Gower, s'il vous plaît. J'ai une question. J'aimerais revenir un peu en arrière. La réponse du greffier à la question du conseiller Al-Shantiri soulève une question sur le 4e point de la page 68. J'ai 2 questions. Ce point porte sur les réductions de dépenses à l'intérieur du budget de la ville, mais le greffier nous dit qu'il faut identifier des lignes particulières pour des comités.
Clarify, would the committees need to identify specific reductions in expenditures from other committees, or could it just be from anything within the city budget of the whole? And the second question would be, can you explain a little bit what would be appropriate offsetting revenues? What would be within the scope of appropriate offsetting revenues?
Thank you for the question. So the city clerk was correct. It's
what we're recommending here is you could look across other standing committees, but they have to be appropriate funds. You have specific tax levies. So, for example, what I heard was a question about taking a fire truck and funding it from transit. Well, you can't do that. Your transit levy is a dedicated levy. We raise it only for transit. You can't use that money to buy a fire truck. So, in consultation with staff, because we would have to tell you, is this an appropriate either an expenditure reduction or a revenue to use for whatever it is you're trying to add to the budget. So there is consultation that goes back and forth in crafting those motions to begin with. We have, I can remember a few years ago, we had an issue with childcare, and they wanted to increase the amount we put into, or maybe it wasn't childcare, I think it was something in the social services area. We collectively went together and worked on it and came up with a way for it to be funded within its own budget. But now we're expanding it a little bit more, so you'd be able to look, for example, non-departmental is one of the bigger areas in the city, and there's lots of revenues and expenditures in there. You'd be able to look in that as well. What is an appropriate revenue is really anything other than a tax increase, because if you ask for a tax increase, then you're asking to go beyond the mandate you've given us. But there's no saying that if you don't have a solution for it, that you can't raise it at committee of the whole and ask for a tax increase at that time, and that has happened in the past as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Menard.
Thanks very much, Mr. Mayor, and through you. So my understanding is that to this point, no mandate has been given to staff on budget directions. That is going to occur next week on the Wednesday. So there is no current mandate.
That's correct.
Okay. And so just to address a couple of other points that my honorable colleagues had mentioned, I want to be clear about what this change is recommending. Without Councillor Nussbaum's motion factoring in at all, the current change in the governance report, if it were to pass today without Councillor Nussbaum's motion, would mean that we are taking from someone else's pocket and putting it into our own pockets in committee structure. That is the recommended change in the budget document. So right now, if you don't pass Councillor Nussbaum's motion, you're going to be taking from other people's pockets and putting it into your own pockets as a committee. As a staff member at FCM previously in the Big City Mayor's Caucus, one of the things we talked about most was the tools that municipalities have to be able to raise revenue, to be able to work within the budgets they have provincially and federally to get things done. And the campaign, indeed, in 2019 is going to speak about those things as well. How there's not enough tools in the toolbox for municipalities and councillors to actually deal with the priorities that they have to deal with at the local level. What this motion does is gives you more tools to work with within the current budget. I see no reason why we should further restrict ourselves, given how restricted we are provincially and federally already, within this process. And so, you know, you can still work with staff. You can still identify offsetting budget increases in other areas if you wish. Those things you can still do. If you prefer to do that and that's your concern, to go to another committee and say, hey, maybe we can work on this together, that's still fair game. But what this also does is say, look, you can also debate at committee of the whole what might be the top priority of another committee. There's a major priority coming forward. You can debate that. You can discuss reserves that may exist. You can also ask staff, and in this current budget report, governance report the way it is, you can't really do that. You can ask staff to identify areas and say, please, you go out and find this spot, because this is a pressure this committee is facing year after year, and we haven't been able to address it. Help us find something here. So this motion frees up our hands, provides more tools for us to work together and identify collectively, as the mayor's comments existed in our swearing-in ceremony, to work together to find what our top priorities are to achieve this. So I'll be in support of this motion. I hope my colleagues also support it.
Thank you. Councillor Blais, please.
Thanks. I want to confirm that the premise that the motion is based on is actually the correct interpretation. So as Councillor Nussbaum described, and I think Councillor Menard just described, and as I'm reading it, whichever committee goes first is going to have the pick of the litter. Right? If I'm committee number 1 and I've got a gap that I want to fund, I'm going to be able to identify that offset from any other of the committee's budgets in my deliberation at committee number 1.
Not quite. So the intent is that every time, if you're not finding the offset within your own particular committee budget, if there's a motion to take from another budget, it actually then goes to committee of the whole. So every committee has the opportunity to look at all the other committee budget, and every one that is cross committee goes to committee of the whole to deliberate on. The ones you decide that you're able to accomplish within your own budget, they can be adopted and approved right there, and they basically go to council and are adopted. But no, you don't get an advantage from being first.
I agree that that's not how it should be. I'm asking if how it's written doesn't lead to that. Which I think is the point. I think the way how it's written leads to the scenario that I said when the intention is the scenario that you said.
If I can just comment on that, it says on the 4th bullet, it will be funded by appropriate offsetting revenues or expenditure reductions from within the city budget as a whole. So I think the treasurer was quite clear on that, Councillor. Madam Treasurer.
I'm sorry, Councillor, I don't understand where it limits us, where it limits the 3rd or 4th committee. They still have that option at looking at from the city budget as a whole, and we provided a clarification. I know Kyle provided it recently that talked about the fact that this would all rise to council.
Yes, but this report doesn't say that that would rise to the committee of the whole. It says we would be able to look at the entire budget as a whole without saying, and the decision on that looking would be made by the committee of the whole. If this is the interpretation I'm fine with, except for we just an hour ago had a 20-minute discussion that no one knew the answer to because management had changed over the years, and I don't want the interpretation to change in year 3 or 4 of the term because, you know, you've decided to move on or someone else has left. If that's the interpretation, I'm happy to live with it, but I want it to be in the interpretation for the 4 years.
That is the intent of it, and we can work with the clerk's office to come up with very precise wording here, but in alignment with the response we gave to, I can't remember the councillor who asked the question.
Okay.
Just to add to that, Mr. Mayor, the Municipal Act requires all municipalities to pass their budget by council, and you cannot defer that in any way, shape, or form or delegate it. And second off, the city's procedure bylaw mandates that council will address the budget in committee of the whole. So those issues are already in place.
Sure. That's fine. Thanks very much, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, thank you. Councillor McKenney, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just want to go back to the, what Councillor Harder raised around the intersections. And the way that this motion is written today with that 4th bullet, the very issue that was of concern that you would be able to, quote unquote, poach from another committee, with this bullet in place, that is exactly what we would be able to do. We would be able to pass a motion at one committee recommending an offsetting reduction in a different committee. Yes, it would. You would have to get that passed at committee by majority, and it would rise to committee of the whole. But it is a significant change to 2014-2018 when we could only identify offsetting reductions within the envelope that was mandated by our committee. Is that correct, Mr. O'Connor?
Yes, Mr. Mayor.
So what this motion does is it takes that away so that you know, if you are at CPSC and that's your last committee and everybody's, you know, we know what has been passed at other committees, we may just be turning around and poaching back. I mean, I think that I think that this actually, I think that this gives us, you know, the opportunity, and not one that I think we want, to be looking at, you know, what priorities and what levels of service we would like to reduce. So we could, in fact, say, you know what, I want an intersection, two more intersections finance in this budget at transportation. We spend a bit of money over there in childcare. So I'm going to take it out of childcare, and that's the motion that goes up. And that is the debate. And let's be clear, with this in place, that is the debate that we will have at Committee of the Whole. What this motion does is it not only takes away that scenario, but it allows for flexibility. If in fact we want to be able to identify a pressure in any standing committee, we'll go back to transportation. You know, we are often asked why we can't put in place the crossing guards to get our kids to school safely. We're asked that all the time. Staff go out, they say, yes, it qualifies, but it's going to be a year or two before you're going to get that crossing guard. So let's just say at Transportation Committee, we've got, you know, we say, you know, that's going to cost, that would be another $100,000 to catch up on that backlog. What the flexibility for us is that we're able to have that debate at Committee of the Whole. Today, when groups come out to us at all of our standing committees, we can sit there, we listen, we may sympathize, but we really can do very little. We can't do anything. We're not going to, you know, take from childcare to put more money into housing. We're not going to do that at our committees. We're not going to do it at transportation. We're not doing it at transit. So what this does is it raises the pressures that we've heard from the public to Committee of the Whole, where, quite frankly, that's where we should be having those conversations. They have to go through committee. You have to have a majority of committee agree to put that on the table, and then we have that discussion and we have our votes, and that's how democracy works, and that's how our city council needs to govern it. We need to have those discussions in public. I disagree that we will be here all day and all night and swapping out. It will be thoughtful. It's why we have standing committees. We all sit on different standing committees. We know what we're doing, and I think that honestly, to take away that issue, that scenario where we will be poaching from other committees and have no other flexibility, really will put us in the scenario that most of us don't want to be in. Thank you.
Councillor Deans, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Well, just hearkening back to the 2014 to 2018 process, I think most of us found it insufficient. It was frustrating to sit in committees and hear members of the public come forward and make extremely passionate points and good points and points that the members of the committee sitting around the table agreed with. And then we'd just say, well, sorry, we don't have any money, and you know, we can't give this group more money even though you're doing amazing work, and we recognize you don't have enough, because we'd have to take it from our housing budget, and they don't have enough either. And so it was frustrating, and I think it led us all to feel like we left the public feeling we weren't listening to them. And that just wasn't good enough. So now the recommendation in the report today sort of opens it up and says, okay, well, you can look beyond your own committee. But I think it leads to a really messy process where maybe I'm not sitting on Environment Committee, but I figure, well, you know, we got these diversion targets to meet, so why don't we just take it out of the garbage contract? I'm not on committee. I'm not as familiar with all the details of the work they're doing, and to just say, I'm gonna solve my problem over there without having those direct discussions with the committee doesn't seem like a process that makes it a lot better to me than the process we had. I mean, it gives you a little more flexibility, but I think it leads to a lot of ill will around this table. So the process that Councillor Nussbaum is recommending is that the committee will listen to the public. The committee does not have to agree with the recommendations coming from the public. But where they very much do agree that this is something that should be considered, this would be sent to the Committee of the Whole and identified as a budget pressure. In the intervening time, the staff would be asked to work perhaps with the committee chair or the mayor's office and the committee chair to identify offsetting budget to address those issues. And then that recommendation would come on the floor of Committee of the Whole. And to me, that is a more reasonable process than it is just pitting committee against committee. And I'm afraid that, well-intentioned though this bullet is, it pits committee against committee, and I think it will leave us with this wonky process where we've maybe poached money from another committee where we didn't fully understand the ramifications of doing it. And so identifying it as a pressure, sending it to the staff, the committee chairs, the mayor's office to try and identify, if we wanted to do that, how would we best go about that? And then that recommendation coming to the Committee of the Whole, to me, is the best process and the one that creates the least disunity on this council. So I would very much support Councillor Nussbaum's motion.
Councillor Leeper, please.
Thank you, Mayor. And I would just like to agree with the previous two speakers, Councillors Deans and McKenney. I think there's a growing recognition around the table this morning that, as written, the process needs to be fixed. I don't think we can pass the recommended process as is without getting ourselves into that situation of cutting lifeguards in order to pay for crossing guards. If that is the only flexibility that we have, I can't imagine the committee wouldn't want to take advantage of that flexibility, but I don't think it's necessarily appropriate. Taking advantage of that flexibility to dip into another committee's budget without having heard the public input, without having heard their priorities, I think most of us around the table would agree is likely going to be inappropriate. I do like the idea of sending up that pressures list and having the totality of the pressures as identified by the committee in front of Committee of the Whole. It gives staff an opportunity to quantify, to make suggestions as to how those can be dealt with over the course of a couple of weeks of discussion and debate. Getting a growing notion of how far away we are from our tax target is going to be important. And the degree to which the Committee of the Whole meeting is a days-long bun fight is really up to us. It is up to us to be disciplined. It is up to us to be thoughtful. It is up to us not to be parochial. It is up to us to take a citywide view. And the degree to which this council can do that will dictate or not the success of this process. I am confident that this council can send up those pressures and have a reasonable discussion, a thoughtful discussion about how we're going to fund those if we can, keeping in mind the tax target that is set out in our directions to staff. We need to fix this line. The way it's going to work, I'm hearing, is not going to be an appropriate way to put our budget together for the next 4 years. The process, as it's been set out by Councillor Nussbaum, gives us an opportunity to understand what all of the committee's priorities are, to take a look at the quantum of those asks, to make determinations about what we can fund or not, where can we find offsets or not. I think if we, one of the nice nuances that Councillor Shirelli has brought is to take away the staff requirement to suggest how to do those offsets. I can certainly see myself supporting that. But the process, we have two processes in front of us right now. One of them is Councillor Nussbaum's, which gets us to a good flexible discussion, or the process as it's been suggested in the governance report, which I think will only lead to a lot of ill will and logistical nightmare. So I'll be supporting Councillor Nussbaum's motion.
Thank you. Councillor Aguilar, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm in an odd position this morning because I'm not crazy about Councillor Nussbaum's motion, but I'm equally not crazy about staff's recommendation for all the work that they put into it. So at this point, I'm feeling like I'm probably going to vote against Councillor Nussbaum's motion, and I'm probably going to vote against staff's recommendation, because I don't think either of them really answers the question, and both of them have the effect, I think, of pitting committee against committee. So Committee A will go first, and they'll decide to take from Committee B. Committee B will go the next day and take from Committee A. And then on the third day, Committee C will take from B and A. And then we'll throw up our hands and we'll say to staff, fix it. And that's not staff's job, it's our job. The current process that we use, we do have the ability to come to Committee of the Whole and make our pitch and say we would like to put more money from this project into that project. That's the funding source, that's what we want to do. I'm not going to say it was done much in the last term, because it wasn't, but it's there and it's available. And one of the things about that appeals is you're doing it as a group, all together, having that discussion. In either of these two scenarios, if you go the report way, again, you're clearly pitting committees, but even if you go Councillor Nussbaum's way, I think you're also putting councillors in a very odd situation, because you sit on Committee A and you decide this is the priority and this is where and that's what you want to do. And then the next day you sit on Committee B, same councillor, different committee, you hear a different group of citizens saying, no, we need to do this. And then you say, oh, wow, yeah, that's right, that's probably a better priority than the one I heard yesterday. And so how do you vote on the priorities in the second committee and the third committee? You're doing it in a vacuum. You're doing it in a vacuum from your colleagues, and you're doing it in a vacuum from getting full input from all the citizen groups, all the stakeholders as to what they want to do. So, as I said, I'm in the odd position right now that I won't be supporting Councillor Nussbaum's motion, but I'll also be asking for a recorded vote on the recommendation of staff, because I don't see myself supporting that either. Unfortunately, as I sit here and I've been thinking about it, I don't have a better idea. And I wish that I did to put forward for us to consider this morning, but I don't think option A or option B solves what people are concerned about or will create a better budget. I fear that what it's going to do is it's going to create more dissension, it's going to create more fights, and to piggyback a little bit on what Councillor Harder said, you know, what you wish for might not be what you wish for. And you might get options on the table that are going to hurt your community, are going to hurt the city as a whole, and are going to pit councillor against councillor. Staff knows the budget process in some ways better than we do. We know our communities, but they know, for example, where you can take the money from, where you can shift it, what you can do with it. And the reality is, at the end of the day, the amount of money that we have to play with on the budget, when you take away the statutory obligations and the shuttered envelopes, is not all that much. I'm not sure everybody around this table understands that at this point in time, but it's not all that much. It's a very, very small slice of the pie. So again, I'm not going to support either. I wish I had a better idea. Maybe staff can come up with a better idea by the 12th, assuming everybody follows my lead and votes everything down. I think that's unlikely. But again, in good conscience, I can't support either of these options, and I won't support either of these options. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Brongton, please.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just a few comments. So next week, we're going to give direction to staff to set a tax target so that they can put together the preliminary budget. And we're going to do that in absence of a full discussion about what our priorities are. We've just gone through an election. We've all heard what the main priorities are for our communities, but we're going to set that target in absence of a full discussion and debate at that time. It's not a binding rate that can be amended by council later on, but we have to give our staff some direction so they can set the preliminary budget. The current system, let's just review the current system. So nothing precludes a councillor in the current system from making changes. Even if there's no room left within their committee to provide additional resources to a particular initiative, they can still address it when it comes to council. And there are ways to address that. We just have a process in place now that has some strict rules and parameters in place so we don't have chaos, because there were some concerns with previous councils and the framework that existed. The proposal allows additional options or provides for additional options and flexibility, and I do think it's wise to have a mechanism where the committee flags its main issues or priorities that are not addressed within the budget it's recommending to council. So as Councillor Eglai might admit and acknowledge, maybe the proposal before us isn't perfect, but I certainly acknowledge there has to be a little more flexibility than what we worked with in the last term of council. There's also the midterm governance review in 2 years. So if we think that this process needs to be changed, if this is passed, there's an opportunity for council within 2 years to reflect and put something forward in that case. So, you know, every budget that we pass must be balanced. So even if committees come with a shopping list of an extra $20 million, there has to be a way to either have an offset or deal with that. We can't pass budgets that aren't balanced. So that is another mechanism that ensures that there's discipline around here. So I do think that the committees have felt somewhat restricted in truly expressing and identifying what additional pressures have been. I certainly support budget prudence, and there has to be limits within there, but I'm certainly open to trying a different option this round to ensure that issues that are not incorporated within committees' budgets are at least flagged for the committee of the whole. And if the committee decides not to do anything in it, but at least it's been addressed and identified through that public process, and that's something I can support this round. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Councillor Fleury.
Merci, Monsieur le Maire. Je pense qu'il faut faire attention de parler.
I think we have to be careful when we talk about the budget process. It's as if we would individually go to a bank to see a financial advisor. When we go see a financial advisor, we have a series of options that are proposed to us, and then we make a personal decision about our money. Now, we have a governance model here where we all have our individual priorities. We have professional staff and the senior management team, and they have their emerging priorities. And all this, with the leadership of the executive director and the office of the mayor, lead us to a budget that is generally recognized as meeting the needs of the whole city. The reason I'm making this comment is because I see the importance of the terms of reference.
Priority. I think that it's really our opportunity as elected officials to highlight what will be the work of senior management over the next 4 years, and how are we going to rate ourselves as part of that. As part of that, there's the work, there's the cost of doing that and the investments of doing that, and then there's the governance issues, which are, you know, the only person elected citywide is our mayor. And it's important to have that element of leadership and giving us a tone in terms of setting out the tax rate. So I understand the process of we establish, you know, go out and do a budget relating to this percentage, staff come back, we table it, and then we go out, we consult, we debate it through committees. I have no issues with that. The challenge arises when we go out to the community. When we go out to the community is not appraised of all of those sets of priorities that form the budget within the tax rates that were discussed and directed upon. So I'm okay. I go to a consultation. Someone says we need a new bus route. I'm intrigued as a councillor. It's not necessarily a budget pressure. It might be a follow-up issue, an operational issue that I have to take on with OC Transpo following the budget consultation. So when we host budget consultations in our community, the community comes out and says, I want this done. We can factor that in many ways, and sometimes the budget allocation is the way to solve, but it's not always. But then we take on that information, we bring it to committee, there's delegations at committee. I have no problem that we stay within the parameters of the overall strategic direction. What I struggle with is then if there's a collective agreement of a new priority that emerged through the budget consultations, then we have to find an offset at this council. So we can't have an emerging issue come out of all of the consultations of all of our committees that is new. We have to find an offset at this committee, at this council. I have no issues leading into all of the structure of formation of the budget, going through committee, going through our consultation. I think that goes smooth, that goes well. It's the structure that if we have an emerging issue and it lands at this table, if it's new, we have to find an offset pressure, even if the majority of council agrees. And that's the type of pressure. If I were our financial advisor, I would say, why remove that tool? Why remove that tool? You have that tool in front of you. Leave it on the table. We have the direction from the mayor's office, from council, and from senior management. Let that be consulted upon. Let the delegations come through. And then if there's no changes, great. It lands at this table. We approve the budget. But if there are, that we can have that conversation and not be squeezed out because we haven't found an offset. That is the nuts and bolts of that issue. Let's not try to reinvent the entire consultation process and budget deliberation process. It's really at this table, can we find new pressures without finding an offsetting amount within the existing budget? And to me, that's the nuts and bolts. I challenge us, like, if you're not comfortable with Toby's motion, then what else would you propose that brings a fix to that issue?
Thank you. Councillor Shirelli and Kavanaugh have withdrawn their motion, amendment. Okay, to wrap up on his motion, Councillor Nussbaum, please.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you very much to colleagues. I listened intently, and I thought that was a really important and interesting discussion. Two issues that I just wanted to raise in summary. One of them is there was a suggestion in some of the interventions that the draft budget, already is representing the staff's best sense of the broader citywide public interest. And I think that's correct, and I think the staff do an excellent job with it. If we aren't prepared to contemplate changes in a more structured way, and that absolutely does risk a discussion around the council table on possible changes, then I am asking myself, why are we here? Why don't we just delegate the budget to staff? Because that would be an option, or simply constrain ourselves even more and say no changes will be permitted. But I think we recognize that a combination of the consultations that we undertake, and by asking citizens to come to committee, and we ask them to do so because we are, I think, implicitly implying that their showing up at committee has the potential to have an outcome that's different from the input. And so I think if we want to be fair and transparent to our publics about what it means to come and show up and take time and speak to each of the individual groups, then we need to think about ways in which we can reflect the outcome of that discussion to committee of the whole in a way that's measured, in a way that doesn't break the bank, but allows for a discussion around the council table on what a majority of committee members feel is a legitimate pressure that needs discussion. And I want to just give one quick example. Over the last term of council, I guess I was responsible for bringing one of the few budget changes to council, and that was a recommended fare freeze for OC Transpo during LRT construction. I wasn't permitted to bring that to the actual transit group, so I had to bring it to committee of the whole. It's very clear from the way the votes landed that had I had the ability to do that, my motion would have failed. A majority of transit commissioners would have said, we don't agree with that concept of a fare freeze. And so the outcome would have been exactly the same, and in fact the discussion would have happened at transit as opposed to full of council with public delegations there, etc. And so so it just is a good example of where simply providing that kind of flexibility does not mean we're going to end up with a different outcome on particular issues. My last observation and comment, and I appreciate Councillor Eglai's struggle, is I am certainly open to trying this as a pilot. Could we do it for a year and reevaluate? The purpose here is not to make life complicated or difficult. The purpose of this motion is to try and find an improvement where we feel that we are listening to the public, providing for a healthy, constructive discussion around the council table that doesn't end up pitting standing committee against each other in the individual process of determining their own budget and their own budget priorities. So I'll stop there. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Great, thank you. Just a couple of observations. I'm not supporting the Councillor Nussbaum motion. I am supporting the staff recommendation, which can be found on page 68 and 69. Let's just clarify a couple of things, first of all. If I don't think there are going to be a lot of occasions where one committee is going to take from another committee. I just don't think that's going to happen, because I think there are a lot of us sit on different committees, and we'll have the voice of that committee to speak for or against a particular issue. But it has to pass the committee. If the committee a majority do not support taking away from the Transit Commission to put into CPS, then it dies and it doesn't go forward. But if it does pass, and this is the change, we've made it more flexible because members of council told me they wanted some flexibility. If it does pass, it has to go through the scrutiny of committee of the whole and then council. So you have those checks and balances, and it's not one-sided. And the second, therefore be it resolved, is really an abdication of our responsibility. We're saying we don't want to take responsibility for being the bearer of bad news. We have to cut someone, so we'll go and ask staff to do it. Well, staff wasn't elected to make the tough decisions. We were. And I remember in years gone by at the old city, Councillor Deans will remember when we asked staff, they came back with, let's cut the wading pools, the Royal Swan program, and crossing guards. Thank you very much for that helpful advice. That went over like a lead balloon, and then we had to regroup and, of course, find other more sensible reductions. This whole issue of the public coming to speak to us, with the system that's been put in place by the staff recommendation, it allows the public to have a say at committee, and they know full well what's going to go up the line to committee of the whole. In the past, there was no requirement for a member of council to signal at committee, I'm going to go and try to take money out of another budget. At least now there's that level of transparency. And the notion, let's be honest with one another. Every single group that appears before us wants more money. Not one group in the last 8 years came asking for less money. So brace yourself, folks. There's going to be a lot of people that are going to come and see us, and sometimes we'll be able to adjust and be flexible, but other times, most of the time, we'll have to say, I'm sorry, we don't have the money to do that, or it's not within our mandate, or because the province has cut this, we're going to have to fill the void. So the reality is that I think what we've done with the staff report is to give greater flexibility so that a matter can go up to committee of the whole and then on to council at budget time. And that's why I think the recommendation from the staff is solid. And I think the Treasurer outlined that very clearly for us. So, Mr. City Manager, if you could give us your thoughts on the Nussbaum motion, and then we'll call for the votes.
Mr. Mayor, I have a couple thoughts that I'd just like to offer for Council's consideration. The first one is that, I've been around long enough to see the various budget processes. I think I'm on my 8th council, and I've seen the various processes that we've had, and I can tell you that the portion of the motion where staff provide recommendations in terms of how to fund particular motions that come out of committee is very challenging outside of understanding what the priorities are of council in terms of what you think are the priorities citywide and in your own wards. A lot of things that senior staff will look at with respect to budget solutions and options are going to be effectively service reductions. And there's things that we would do maybe from a pure business case perspective that might be totally unpalatable politically. Waiting pools was something that was tried in the past. We have underutilized facilities. We have client service centers in the rural areas that the Auditor General said we should close, yet the public believes that they should be open, particularly in those wards. There's all kinds of things that if we actually started looking at, we would put on the list that you would consider, but I don't know how that would be helpful because it would basically effectively pit a councillor against councillor in terms of the wards and the priorities in your own wards, let alone what your priorities are citywide. Our strategic plan is coming to council in the spring. We're going to start that process. We're in a hurry-up kind of offense for this budget. We have two budgets. I just want to remind council, Mayor, we have two budgets being approved in 2019. The 2019 budget, which will be approved at the end of March, early April, and then the 2020 budget, which will be approved later in the year, probably around December. In between that, there's a provincial budget that lands in the spring, and I worry also about the discipline for our staff in particular, because that's what I can manage, but your own discipline in terms of being able to respond to any provincial budget cuts and getting ahead of ourselves in terms of making commitments of finding savings and adding new priorities and budget pressures when we don't know what the impact is going to be of significant service changes or funding recommendations. The other thing I'd like to add is, and I believe one of the councillors, I think it was Councillor Eglay, mentioned, is that there isn't as much flexibility as you might think in the budget, because many of the items in the budget are provincially funded. They're transfer payments, they're federal money, they're revenue sources that we have, they're fares, parks and recreation fees. There isn't as much flexibility, quite frankly, that you have access to all the committees to make the same equal, and as Marion said, it has to be an appropriate reduction offset. You don't find appropriateness in every committee because of the nature where the funding comes from, whether it's rate, whether it's capital funding, whether it's provincial funding, and we have mandates that we have to deliver. The other thing I would offer is that a committee of the whole, we come to work every day to try to solve problems for councillors. That's our belief, that's our mandate, and nothing stops councillors, especially if the next two motions pass, which basically direct that the chairs of the committees will work with the mayor and the city manager to develop the budget, and each individual councillor will meet with the mayor and the city manager and the treasurer to look at your own priorities. You will have significant input into the development of that budget, and that's the time when we can get an assessment from you in terms of what things you think are priorities and not priorities for us as we finalize the budget and bring it to you. But that does not stop any member of council from moving a motion, a committee of the whole, from anything you've heard either through your recent election, you were just out on the door and you have a pretty good sense of what's happening, or what happens from people that come to the committee. So the thing that I'm hoping is that the days of when we used to have Tom Fedek, who was our budget director, used to keep tally of all the changes that was happening and motions that were happening at committee of the whole, and we used to put the tax rate up on the screen every half hour. Someone would call it out and go, there was a fake drum roll, and we put the number up, and it'd go up and it'd go down, and staff, we're trying to give you options in terms of what to do. And for me, and I think for a lot of us around the council table who have been engaged in this process in the past, making those kind of decisions on the fly without good analysis, without a good priority framework for us to work in, makes it very challenging to give you the best possible options so you can achieve your objectives.
Yeah, I think Councillor Harder made the point, in years gone by, it was like the Jerry Lewis telethon, they'd put the number up and it'd keep going up and up and up. And, by supporting the motion, we're abdicating our responsibility. We have to make some tough decisions. And if the province or the federal government come down with a budget that impacts us, we have to make some tougher decisions. So I'd encourage members of council to keep control of the budget process at this table and vote against the new SPAW motion. Yeas and nays, please. This is on the new SPAW motion.
Councillor Eglay.
No.
Councillor Suds.
No.
Councillor Dudas.
No.
Councillor El Shantiri?
No.
Conseil Blais?
No.
Councillor Moppett?
No.
Councillor Shirelli?
Yes.
Councillor McKenney?
Yes.
Councillor Harder?
No.
Conseil Cloutier?
No.
Councillor Luloff?
No.
Councillor Menard?
Yes.
Conseil Fleury?
Oui.
Councillor Hubley?
No.
Councillor Tierney?
No.
Councillor Nussbaum?
Yes.
Councillor Derues?
No.
Councillor Deans?
Yes.
Councillor Gower?
No.
Councillor Meehan?
Yes.
Councillor Kavanagh?
Yes.
Councillor Brockington?
Yes.
Councillor Leeper?
We.
Mayor Watson?
No.
10 yeas, 14 nays.
Okay, so on the report as presented. Oh, sorry. Sorry, we have two more motions. Sorry, excuse me, we have two more motions, so let's get to them. Councillor Deans, budget process, Councillor Blais seconds it.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Maybe just read the be it resolved.
I'll just read the be it resolved. Therefore, be it resolved that the fifth bullet in the recommended process for the 2018 to 2022 tax-supported budgets as outlined on page 67 and 68 in the 2018 to 2022 Council Governance Review Report be amended such that the city manager be directed to work with the mayor's office, and here's the change, and each committee chair to develop draft annual budgets that are consistent with the council's approved budget direction. I think this is probably the intent of the process anyway, but it just didn't say that the committee chairs would, the city manager would work with the committee chairs, and often the committee chairs are the link to the communities of interest in those particular budgets. So I think it will just enhance the process to have the city manager work with the committee chairs as well, and it's seconded by Councillor Blais.
Okay, Councillor Hubley on this motion.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Not on the motion, but for every motion, could we ask staff to put the bottom part, the therefore be it resolved on the screen so we can see what we're voting on?
Okay,
thank
good
you.
point. Thank you. So on the Deans Blais motion, carried. Carried, thank you. The next is by Councillor Shirelli. Who's seconding it, Councillor?
Councillor Kavanagh.
Don't withdraw this one, okay? All right.
Okay, so it's therefore be it resolved that the recommended process for 2019 to 22 tax-supported budgets as outlined on page 67 and 68 in the 2018 to 2022 Council Governance Review Report be amended such that the mayor will consult with each member of council with respect to the member's individual budget priorities and concerns before the mayor's office works with the city manager to develop the draft annual budgets. This may have happened anyway, but it puts it into the document.
Okay, on the motion, carried. Adopté. So on the main motion as presented, yeas and nays. So this is the main staff recommendation on pages 68, 69.
Councillor Eglai?
No.
Councillor Suds?
Yes.
Councillor Dudas?
Yes.
Councillor El Shantiri?
Yes.
Conseil Blais? Councillor Moffat?
Yes.
Councillor Shirelli?
No.
Councillor McKenney?
No.
Councillor Harder? Yes. Conseil Cloutier?
Oui.
Councillor Luloff?
Yes.
Councillor Menard?
No.
Conseil Fleury?
Oui.
Councillor Hubley?
Yes.
Councillor Tierney?
Yes.
Councillor Nussbaum?
No.
Councillor Derues?
Yes.
Councillor Deans?
No.
Councillor Gower?
No.
Councillor Meehan?
No.
Councillor Kavanagh?
No.
Councillor Brockington?
Yes.
Councillor Leeper?
No.
Mayor Watson?
Yes.
14 yeas, 10 nays.
Okay, so the next item on our agenda is accountability and transparency, that the 2018 annual report of the Integrity Commissioner is attaches document 2 be received, pages 74 to 75. Received. Item 2, that the following measures be implemented to address the mandatory requirements resulting from Bill 68, the Modernizing Ontario's Municipal Legislation Act 2017. A, establish the draft code of conduct for members of local boards bylaw as described in the report and document 2 and attached in document 3. That the Integrity Commissioner engage an external lawyer on retainer as described in the report and in document 2, and adopt the process for publicly registering declarations of interest as described in this report in document 2. Carried. Item 3, establish the draft code of conduct for members of council bylaws described in this document, as provided in this report, and document 2 is attached as document 4 on pages 77 to 79. Carried. Establish the draft code of conduct for citizen members of the Built Heritage Subcommittee bylaw as described in the report in document 2 and attached as document 5, pages 77 to 79. Carried. Item Part 3, local boards. Receive the updated listing of local boards in document 6 and the status report on the compliance of the city's agency boards and commissions with respect to the Municipal Act 2001 policy requirements as outlined in this report, and direct staff to provide a further update on ABC compliance, agency boards and commission, as part of the 2018-2022 midterm governance report. And Councillor Fleury has a motion seconded by Councillor El-Shantiri. Conseiller Fleury.
Merci, Monsieur le Maire. Je vais,
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
before I present my motion, I'll begin by just setting out some context. So, as members of council, your area might have business improvement associations. Because they're in your area right away, you're a member of the board, and I want to thank the clerk for clarifying. My second whereas is staff initiated, and it really clarifies our role on the BIA as ex officio members. It has been situations for me that have been complex because I've had situations where I've had to vote against the BIA budget specifically because I didn't see the improvement for our business community on some of our main corridors, and I wanted some clarity as to what is my role on those local boards. I have no way of not sitting on the board. I want to support our business community, but I didn't agree with the board direction. So I want to thank the clarification and the work of our clerk relating to that. This motion's a bit different. This motion really relates to, if you go further down, really relates to we have different size BIAs in our community. We want to support them completely. We want to make sure that as they pull the levy, as our finance team pulls the taxes and the levy, that we're able to support their operations. And I want to thank Councillor El-Shantiri for his work with the OCOBIA, but also for clarifying to me some of the risk relating to my initial intent. And my pursuit of this motion is really to guide OCOBIA in a conversation relating to how we account for some of our larger BIAs who have larger budgets and for whom we need proper reporting and governance. So I want to, what really this does is it ensures that the agenda, as an agenda item, that be discussed so that we can support our larger BIAs without impacting those that have smaller budgets, but really relating to some of the independence about financial management and accountability reporting to that.
Thank you, and thank you for working with Councillor El-Shantiri because he is our liaison with BIAs, and he's done some great work with them, so I'm glad that you've included them in the consultation. And someone who knows a lot about BIAs, Councillor Suds.
I'd have to chime in on this one for sure. Just to state, I do support this. I think that having lived and breathed the ins and outs of running a BIA, there are certainly some cautions when it comes to the financial situation and the stability of these organizations. And I think the direction as provided here, exploring alternative governance and financial management models would definitely be well received. So,
thank you.
Great. So on the motion as presented, carried. On the report as amended, carried. Item number 2, receive an update on guidance and guidelines for selection panel members as described in this report, pages 87, 88. Carried. Item 3, the Ottawa Lands Development Corporation Board of Directors be 6 members consisting of 4 members of council and 2 citizen members as outlined in this report. And we have, I believe it's just now one motion from Councillor Brockington, seconded by Councillor Leeper. So Councillor Brockington, if you can have the floor or introduce your motion, please.
I do want to speak to the main motion. Can I do that now, or do you want the motions?
Well, you have to introduce your motion first.
Okay, so I'll put that on the floor. Thank you, Your Worship. Moved by myself, seconded by Councillor Leeper. The item before us now is to talk about a provision that will provide a ward councillor the opportunity to address the board if her or his community or property within his or her community is on the agenda. Right now, for some context, particularly for our new members, the Ottawa Community Lands Development Corp was created almost 10 years ago in 2007. It's an arm's length corporation. It has an 8-member board. They're all elected members of City Council who are on that board, and they deal with the city's property. Because of the confidential nature of their dealings, if you're not a member of the board, you are not privy to attend their board meetings, just because of real estate matters. And so as issues come up in your ward, you are briefed by a staff of the Corp, and you have an opportunity to provide input. But if there are matters that are quite contentious within your community that you want the board in particular to hear, you don't have that opportunity. And I can say from firsthand experience that I'm well aware of the corporation and what they deal with, and having not been a member of this board, absolutely implore members of council to vote in favor of this. I don't think really there should be any matter dealt with in our wards that we cannot be fully informed about and have the full opportunity to address the board or commission or any other body that's dealing with our ward under the auspices of the City of Ottawa. And so this provides an opportunity not to be on the board, not to sit on the whole agenda, but if there's an agenda item on this corporation's agenda in your ward, that you have the opportunity to address that board for that item. And that's why I'm moving that today, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, thank you. So just for clarification, if a piece of land is going to be sold, it has to first go through FEDCO, is that correct?
Yes, Mr. Mayor. Maybe I can just sort of give a brief explanation in terms of the process. So you're absolutely correct. If property is to be circulated, we're considering to be surplus, it goes to the various city departments, including the ward councillor. During that time, obviously, the ward councillor is consulted. If subsequently the decision is to move it forward into the Ottawa Community Lands Development Corporation, obviously that takes action by FEDCO as well as council. Once again, the local ward councillor would be consulted in that regard. And we've had situations in the time, from time to time, where the councillor has basically asked that certain things to be done. So as a result of that, that would be included within the staff report. That would then go to FEDCO, making the recommendation that the lands be transferred into the Ottawa Community Lands Corporation and ultimately up to council. So once it does get into the Ottawa Community Lands Development Corporation, it's for the board itself, the directors, to discuss what's going to happen with that particular property. And when we get into the actual disposal process, it's done on a confidential basis, because each one of the directors of the board have a fiduciary responsibility to the board to keep it on a confidential basis. And as was pointed out earlier, we do apprise the council in terms of what's happening as we go through the process. And then once the transaction has been approved, basically once there again, the council, local ward council, would be engaged through the process as far as the site plan or the subdivision agreements, anything that's going to be done at a later date.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Shirley, please.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just if we look back at the reason we created this corporation, and I think it gives a good outlook as to why this motion's in front of us. Originally, and in most places, when a city has surplus properties, it declares them surplus. They go on sale, and in many cases, they have a real estate agent or some other mechanism for conducting the sale, and it's all about price, or almost always about price. Several years ago, we discovered or realized that there was property that the city was divesting itself of, that would then get rezoned and become worth significantly more money because of the rezoning. And we did not, or the taxpayers did not see any of that money. So one of the reasons for creating the corporation was to get taxpayers in on a share of that uplift price that resulted from the rezoning. Secondly, if we were to just sell a property, there are only certain tools we would have to determine what could be put on the property, what type of plan, et cetera. So somebody who bought it would put in their application, and we could only deal with it as planning committee with the tools available there. So one of the reasons we created the corporation, the second reason, was that we could, as owners of the property, put a plan on the property or specify what type of plan the property would have and what could be built there. Much more control than we had through the planning process. Thirdly, we wanted to ensure smaller developers had opportunities to develop this former city land as opposed to just the big three. And fourth, it was about price. But price was only one of the four components. We had those other three. Now, by moving it out of, say, for instance, a real estate agent selling the property or an auction selling the property into this corporation doing it, we actually limit the role of the councillor to the very start saying, here's what I'd like to see. But that's before there's any consultation. And so I think what's happening is there's a fourth or fifth element of having created the corporation that wasn't in the goals of the corporation. And that fifth element was it could operate in secret. And there are advantages to that from the point of view of selling property, but there are disadvantages from the point of view of trying to ensure the development occurs as much as possibly in conjunction with the public. Right now, if a private sector developer wants to develop a property, they come to see the councillor with what they're planning. That step isn't there if we continue like this without compelling the councillor to be part of it. And so I don't think this process is necessarily bad if we keep our eyes on the goals, but if we don't ensure that we have at least as much involvement by the councillor at the pre-consultation stage as exists today, then we have what a couple of councillors have objected to over the past 4 years. So I don't see councillors who aren't on the committee wanting to go to every committee meeting or anything like that, and I don't think this motion would require that, but I think it is a good idea that when that plan is being developed, the councillor be part of that plan.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Blais, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I think Councillor Shirley was right in terms of why the corporation was created, and he was around when it was created. Selling land can be tough. City owns a lot of land, and sometimes people think that vacant land is a park, or sometimes when it's not, or they think it's this when it's not, and so it can be controversial. That's part of the benefit of having the OCLDC. Not all land goes to the OCLDC. So for land to be sold, first we as a group have to decide that we don't need it and we don't want it. Then we have to decide it's substantial enough that something real could happen there and there could be value uplift, so we're going to send it to OCLDC instead of selling it ourselves. There is lots of opportunity for the local councillor to intervene at either of those stages. So if it is a political problem or if it is a political process, there's already lots of politics there. Adding a third layer of politics in the negotiation of the sale of the land, I don't think is a very good idea. I don't know who's necessarily buying the land next door to me until they move in. And I'm not sure that I should have as a role in that process. If the land is important to you, don't vote for it to be sold. If it's really important to you, vote for the city to do something with it. Turn it into a park, or do a community design plan, or get money to build a fire station, or whatever the heck it is you want. But if it's really that important to you, then it shouldn't be surplused. If you're saying it's surplus, then really the market then should take over. And if you don't like the zoning they're coming forward with, don't vote for zoning at planning and don't vote for zoning at committee. But inserting more politics into a process you've already pre-decided or inserting politics into a piece of land that you've already decided isn't important enough for you to want to do anything publicly with doesn't make the process any better or any more transparent. So I would encourage everyone to vote against this, let the OCLDC go off and do their work, and make profit for taxpayers. If that's not the goal, then let's get rid of OCLDC altogether and just sell land through the real estate agent like before, and taxpayers will miss out on the value uplift and the opportunities.
Thank you. Councillor Harder, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and I totally agree with Councillor Blais. I think Councillor Blais and I have been on the OCLDC since its inception. In fact, I was the first chair. And it was created under the corporation was created under the Business Act of Ontario as opposed to the Municipal Act for the very reasons that it operates the way it does. And one of the things that has been troubling for some people is the confidentiality aspect of it, and the fact that when we're wearing our corporate hat, we're not operating under the Municipal Act, and that's okay. It was set up for the reasons, as Councillor Blais said, and to make money for the city, while at the still time putting the values in that Councillor Chiarelli spoke to, and having the opportunity to control what kind of development was going there. Make no mistake about it, after the decisions going forward, really after the sale is made and the zoning goes forward, etc., that's a very public process, as Councillor Brockington knows, and it comes to the planning committee or AREC or wherever it needs to go. I just wanted to ask Mr. O'Connor if perhaps he could just tell us the difference between the Municipal Act and the Business Act and how it relates to this, and why we don't have the sitting councillor coming into if it happens to be one of their items. Is that appropriate? Mr. O'Connor?
I'm sorry, Mr. Mayor, could the councillor repeat the question?
Sure. I just, the difference with the corporation, the OCLDC corporation, is that it operates under the Business Act, as does Hydro Ottawa, for example, as well, as opposed to the Municipal Act, and just the differences between those two.
Yeah, the fundamental difference is, and I think it's already been referenced by some of the other members, is the fact that this is in fact a private corporation. It is built for a specific purpose, for it to be arm's length from council. You are the sole shareholder, so once a year they come and you would get to make decisions and receive information from them. But for all of that, they are not subject to public meeting notices. They are not subject to dealing with freedom of information requests, closed meetings, investigations, all of those things, because none of those things are done in the private sector.
So in the last 5 to 8 years, the #1 infill area in the entire city of Ottawa, you would think it would be Kitchissippi, or you would think it would be one of the older neighborhoods. It in fact was Barrhaven, and it operated under the OCLDC. And it operated within the guidelines that were put forward at the end of the Nepean days, but also that were changed to reflect opportunities to have control over changes that we wanted to make, whether it meant back rear yard lanes, whether it made connection to, in fact, it was likely one of the very first transit-oriented developments that we did was the Longfields in the Barrhaven area, now that I come to think about it. But I think that since its inception, that corporation has raised, I probably am under-guessing it, but about $80 million for the city of Ottawa. Is that about right, Gord?
Through the mayor, it's been multi-millions of dollars. I don't know if it's exactly 80, but it's been multi-millions of
Well, it
dollars.
was 50 and 30, as I recall, so that's where I came up with the 80, okay? And yet we still kept the control, and yet it still came back to planning committee. So just because maybe the other thing too is that the councillor, even if they were allowed to attend, would not be allowed to go out and speak on it in their community. So I think that when you have the conversation is when it comes forward, there's a piece of land at the old whatever, Chinese place on Richmond Road, okay? And we're going to give it to them because we want them to market it for us. That's the time when that counselor, because you're making a decision, should talk to them before they get into the process. Have the conversation then. And then certainly, you know, once it comes back to planning and that, you'll have all the opportunities. But the guidelines that they follow are ones that we've set out. Good planning practices. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Leeper, please.
Thanks, Mayor. I think one of the fundamental issues that I take with the way OCLDC operates without that ward councillor input is that it is unfair. There are a number of us as councillors who have an inside view as to what is happening in our ward if there is a piece of property that is going to be sold. We are at the table if there is a discussion about things like the potential buyers wanting rezonings, and you know we have that heads up in our meetings, whereas many councillors do not have that. And I know that we are supposed to wear different hats, and I am always happy to keep the confidentiality of OLDC, but it is nonetheless an unfairness, and I don't see a huge issue with allowing the ward councillor to get the same view of those dealings as the councillors who sit on the committee, obviously subject to NDAs. So I will be supporting Councillor Brockington's motion because I think it addresses a fundamental unfairness between the various different councillors on council.
Councillor DeRose, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just I want to cautious people or my colleagues at this table, because the process we have right now, it works well for city councillors because we are taking the politics out of the sales. We're not a real estate agent, and we shouldn't be involved in this process. I know the process helped me in the last term because I know that I did work, there was a property was sold in my community, and I was very happy with the process. I approached OCLDC and I spoke to them about the parcel, and they informed me that they're going to put it for sale. If there is a piece important for you in your community and you really think you can do something with it, you should maybe approach them and talk to them. But the process works well, and I caution my colleague from politicizing this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Deans, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Well, I sat on this Land Development Corporation for the past term of council, and I want to tell you about the most uncomfortable day that I had on that Land Development Corporation, and it was sale of a piece of property to an abutting landowner. The abutting landowner was a gravel pit. The sale of this particular property was not going to be used for gravel extraction, but the net impact, because you have to have a buffer from residential property, was to actually move the gravel pit much closer to a residential neighborhood. That was the net impact. And I felt very uncomfortable with making that decision, knowing that was the net impact of it, without the ward councillor even knowing we were doing that. There's no approval process to come, because this was now going to, instead of the buffer that they had, that buffer then could be used for gravel extraction because they're purchasing a new buffer much closer to people's homes. And I felt if that had been in my ward as a member of council, I should have been told that as part of the process so that I could let my residents know, and if they objected to that, this is city property, that they should have the right to input into the process. But that was done without the knowledge of the ward councillor or the community that was being impacted by that sale of the land. And that was an uncomfortable day for me. And that's why I really think that Councillor Brockington has it right, where there's impacts on community and impacts on the councillor that answers for those impacts, that they should be made aware of that. And that doesn't always happen. That's why I'm going to support Councillor Brockington's motion.
Okay, I think Councillor Harder has an amendment that I believe is friendly to Councillor Brockington that may bring more people to support the motion. Councillor.
So if anyone's interested, on page 90 where it speaks to the board composition, one of the things that the corporation has recommended is furthermore to avoid potential conflicts of interest, it would be preferable the members of council appointed to the board not be members of planning committee, nor from wards that contain significant parcels of land to be handled by the OCLDC. So if you look at Kitchissippi, if you look at College Ward, and you look at Barrhaven, where there's been a lot, and all three of us on the planning committee, we're not even allowed to be on the board. I think that that's quite restrictive. So if we pull that out as a friendly amendment, I think that then there's absolutely room to support Councillor Brockington, and then we allow anybody to be on that puts their name forward. But the corporation still has the sanctity of its privacy and operates under the Business Act. And the person that the councillor who is of the area, when they come to the table, has to absolutely be under the same rules of privacy, but they absolutely get to participate. So that's my friendly amendment.
Okay, so if you can just write that out and get a seconder. And we'll,
do we need a seconder? Oh, Councillor Shirelli said he would second.
Yeah, at council.
It's friendly, though. Yeah.
Councillor Shirelli will second it, but that's not a good omen. Okay, so on Councillor Harder's friendly amendment, carried. On the report as amended by Councillor Brockington. Yeah, we just, no, it's, you want to speak again? I think you have unanimous support.
I had asked at the beginning if I wanted to say a few comments on the main recommendation, not my motion.
You've got a lot of enthusiasm for your motion now.
But that motion we've dealt with.
We're on your motion now.
I want to talk about the composition of the board, which is the main motion.
Do you have? All right, so the floor is yours. We just carried the amendment.
Correct.
So we're asking for people to vote on the motion as amended.
Okay, let's deal with that.
Okay, carried. Carried?
Good.
There we go.
I just have a question
carried
for
now.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay. The next technical amendment is from Councillor Fleury, seconded by Councillor McKenney, on the Ottawa Board of Health interim appointments. Conseiller Fleury, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So this was brought to us by the clerk of Ottawa Public Health Board. I'll present the motion. Basically is that until the new members, until the selection committee has selected new members, there's one or two meetings. So we're asking to extend the appointment of all citizen members until the appointments have been done by council.
Okay, on the motion, carried. Thank you for that. The next item is report recommendations part 4. Amendments to various bylaws, policies, and related matters. The amendments to the procedure bylaw is described in this report in document 7, pages 93 to 99. Councillor Eglai has a motion, seconded by Councillor Fleury, with respect to release of committee agendas earlier.
Very much, Mr. Mayor. So as a committee chair, and I think I can speak for all the committee chairs over the last couple of terms, one of the most common concerns we hear from delegations, community associations, public stakeholder groups is they feel they don't have enough time to digest the report when it comes out, don't have enough time to meet and consider it so that they can come to committee and make a presentation. So what I am proposing, it's a very simple change wording-wise. It changes it from 7 calendar days to 7 business days. What that effectively means is that the advance notice for reports and agendas for public committee meetings will be 9 days, and in certain cases, if there's a holiday Monday, for example, it would be 10 days. So it gives just a little bit more time for people to consider the reports and make arrangements if they want to come down to the actual meeting and speak to it. So again, we've all just finished knocking on doors, thousands and thousands of doors across the city, and I'm sure that at many of them you heard that they want council to be more transparent, more open, more accessible. I think this is a good step towards doing that, and I would hope that everybody would support this motion. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. So on the motion as presented by Councillor Eglai, carried. Councillor Brockington on, I just was explaining to Councillor Brockington the desire on the next point. It's not, correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Clerk, it's shall, not should. So it's a recommendation because sometimes you'll put forward an inquiry, and if staff have enough time, they can bring you an answer at the council meeting. But there's no restriction. You can still bring an inquiry at the committee meeting or the council. It's just we're encouraging you to try to do it 24 hours in advance so staff have a chance to respond. And the issue may go away because it's resolved, or it may not and it needs further study. So with that information, Councillor, are you okay with leaving it shall instead of should? Or should instead of shall? Should instead of shall?
Yeah, I'm okay with that as long as there's a strong understanding that if a member has an inquiry, they haven't given notice, there'll be no issue with the response.
And the clerk can concur with that? Okay. Thank you very much, Councillor. Oh, Councillor Eglai?
Yes, thank you. I sort of started this, I think, with my inquiry on inquiries last term. Everybody thought it was kind of funny at the time, but the motivation behind it was real, and it continues to be real. And the reason that I supported this and asked for this to be included in the governance report is we keep track of the inquiries made. We keep track of when they've been answered. One of the things we don't really keep track of is the cost in terms of real dollars and resources. And often staff are in the middle of a meeting and somebody throws out an inquiry to them, and staff feels, I think, that they need to say, yes, we can do that. And then we don't really see what the hidden cost of that is. So I want to thank staff for putting forward this recommendation, and I would encourage all councillors to, even though it's should instead of shall, I'd like you, if you can, all lean towards the shall, because there is a real hidden cost here to the taxpayer, and many of these things can be fixed through a phone call to a manager of a department, through an email exchange. Once we get into the formal inquiry piece, there's circulations that have to be done, there's translations that need to be, the costs add up quickly as well as staff time. So I encourage everybody to please give some advance notice to staff. Staff can then come back to us as a group and say, interesting question, but oh, by the way, it's going to cost $17,000 to answer that question. And we can weigh in on whether that's a reasonable way to spend taxpayers' money. So again, thank you for the opportunity to speak to that, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Councillor Brockington, for withdrawing your motion.
That's a good point. Thanks to both councillors. On the motion, carried as amended. Item 2 is the amendments to the delegation of authority bylaws described in report and document 8. Councillor Harder and Eglai have an amendment. Councillor Harder. So this is on third-party infrastructure agreements. I believe it's technical in nature to give staff a little bit more flexibility to get on with the job.
To the further authority to the general manager?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm sure that Mr. Willis can explain better than I can, but basically we right now have a situation where for anyone who has a lot of work going on, it will mean the difference between taking an opportunity of not having the road cut again in like 2 months when you have the work done. So this is taking advantage of opportunities, which I would think will be cost saving for sure, but taking that advantage when we know that there's a project that's already been approved and is in the budget for a given year, and we can have the flexibility to have it undertaken. We already do that with the other side, so the private business, where we have a project going on that they work with us, and we have the authority over it as well. So perhaps Mayor Watson, Mr. Willis could just speak. As this is, Mr. Willis could just comment on it?
Mr. Willis, go ahead.
Very quickly, Mr. Mayor. The department and my role currently already has delegated authority to when third parties want us to do work for them within city construction projects, to coordinate construction so the construction all happens at the same time. Think about utility companies, think about MTO, think about Enbridge, others like that. where we can do it for them, provided we get reimbursed. We just want the reverse opportunity as well, so that when a construction coordination is actually an opportunity for us, we could actually do that and get that reimbursed. And there are checks and balances in terms of the procurement requirements on that in the motion, so that, as I said, would give it. It's a very modest amount. Any larger amount like that would come to committee and council.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so on Councillor Harder's motion, amendment, carried. On the motion as amended, carried. Item 3, the amendments to the procurement bylaws described in this report, pages 105, 106, carried. The amendment to the Ottawa Fire Services bylaws described in this report, pages 106, 107, adopted. Item 5, the amendments to the appointment policy as described in this report and in document 9. Councillor Kavanagh has a motion seconded by Councillor Luloff, and Councillor Dudas has given a friendly amendment, I believe, that would you want to maybe introduce your motion and the friendly amendment all at once? Councillor Kavanagh, please.
Much, and I want to thank my colleagues, Councillor Luloff for seconding it, and Councillor Dudas for her friendly amendment. It's very appropriate. And I actually want to thank the previous council for working towards this, because they did do work on looking into a women's bureau, and this is what is leading to this. And so I want to give them that thanks, because we've got work to do. And this is to look towards, as you can read from it, that it's the goal of appointing 50% representation of women and taking into account diversity where possible. So this is working towards a goal, and I'm very proud of the fact that we are doing this as a council, and I hope you'll support this. Thank you very much.
Great, and just for clarification, Councillor Dudas's motion includes and take into consideration diversity as the amendment, and you're content with that. So I'd urge members of council to support this. This was the 50-50 gender balance was something that I made a commitment to during the election campaign, and I think it certainly, we get a lot of really good applications from men and women across the city, and I think this is timely, and I'm glad we're doing it on the first meeting. So on the motion, carried, adopté. Thank you very much. Next is the item is amended, carried. Item 6, the amendments to the Advisory Committee's participation expense policy described in this report in document 10, pages 110 and 111, carried. Item 7, the amendments to the Advisory Committee procedure bylaw and code of conduct are described in this report in document 11, page 111, 112. Councillor Nussbaum on item 7.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a very quick technical question on this item, and it also applies to a few other documents that we are passing through now. One of the changes in this bylaw is changing the term clerk to city clerk and solicitor for the city of Ottawa. I guess my two questions are, is it deemed that using the word clerk in this bylaw is problematic? So is there a problem we're trying to solve? And then I guess the second question is, although we cannot anticipate a day when Rick O'Connor is not here with us. Unfortunately, I imagine one day he will want to grab his fishing rod. And so at that time, if there is a decision to have the city clerk and the city solicitor be two different people, then would we not have to amend these bylaws again? And so hence my first question, is there a problem that we need to solve now, or are we just creating? So that's essentially what the question is. Thanks.
Mr. Mayor, the staff recommendation of this was solely to include my current title, and I am not offended if council says, let's just leave clerk as it is. So you would, I agree with the councillor, you would have to change it when I eventually leave. So I'm good.
I think that's in the weeds category there. All right, carried. Item number 8. The public conduct policy and corporate trespass to property procedures is described in this report and attached in document 12 and 13, pages 112 to 142. Carried. Item 9, the amendments in the commemorative naming policy is described in this report and in document 14, pages 143 to 144. Carried. Item 10, the amendments to the licensing bylaw for vehicle for hire bylaw and the property standards bylaw as described in this report in document 15, and we have a Amendment by Councillor Menard, seconded by Councillor McKenney.
Thanks very much, Mr. Mayor. Some of this is just housekeeping, but after reading reports with regard to this committee, it became clear that we could clean our process up to ensure complainants also receive notice if an order affecting them has been appealed, and further that standing could be granted by the committee to the original complainant in front of the PSLAC to provide further context to the original complaint. I worked with staff on this. Indeed, there was some cleaning up of the language on staff sides as well with this motion to ensure their support, and checked with legal on this, and it seems we've got agreement there. So I hope my colleagues support the motion.
Okay, Councillor Fleury.
Well, I'm just curious as to the, I like that we're bringing in and clarifying some of the policy issues, but I'm concerned, like for example, the property standards, there's a very particular issue where if a tenant raises, let's say a mold issue, moves out, then the complaint loses. So there's a lot of property standard components, property maintenance that are at play. I wonder, like, we're passing this amendment, but if council deems to review these policies as part of term of council priority, that would not alleviate that opportunity. Is that correct? Okay, thank you.
Okay, on the motion, and staff have reviewed this, Mr. Willis, in your department, you're comfortable with this? I think some changes have been made.
Mr. Mayor, I don't think we're as directly affected by this. I think Mr. DeMonte's group is more directly affected by this.
Mr. DeMonte? My understanding, Councillor Menard, you had staff help with the drafting of this, so okay, that's fine. Thank you. Carried? Carried. Item 10, item 11, renewal of the temporary, 10 is amended. Carried. Item 11, the renewal of the temporary boring bylaw as described in this report and in document 20. Carried. Part 5, other matters. Item 1, the creation of positions of Council Liaison for Housing and Homelessness, Sports Commissioner, and Council Liaison for Women's Issue to be considered by the Nominating Committee and City Council as described in this report. Councillor Deans has a name change on the item. Councillor Deans, please. Seconded by Councillor McKenney.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll just read the therefore be it resolved part. Therefore be it resolved that the language in recommendation 1 under part 5 other matters in 2018-2022 governance review report be amended to change the name of the Council Liaison for Women's Issues to the new title of Council Liaison for Women and Gender Equity, and therefore be it resolved that the new position title of Council Liaison for Women and Gender Equity be reflected throughout the 2018 to 2022 Governance Review Report wherever the previous title appeared. And let me just say, I think it was me that wrote this back in March 2018, but I just want to acknowledge that since that time it has become clear that the preferred and current language is women and gender equity, and so just trying to reflect that in the most up-to-date language we can.
Thank you. On the motion, carried. Councillor Deans has another motion with respect to housing and homelessness special liaison, signed by Councillor Brockington. You want to go to there?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The be it resolved says that council appointed special liaison on housing and homelessness also be a member of the Community and Protective Services Committee. And the reason for this is during 2014 to 2018 period when there was a liaison appointed, that person was not a member of CPS, and it left a bit of a disconnect. There was no reporting relationship to the committee. I just think it's important that we signal how much we view housing and homelessness as an important thing for this council to be seized with by naming a special liaison, but it's also important that we have a reporting structure that works and that there's a link to the committee that has carriage of this issue. So I think if it is a member of the committee that is a special liaison, it will work best. We don't know who that's going to be yet. So just saying you still have a pool of people to choose from, but it would be someone on CPS.
Okay, Councillor Shirelli, on this motion.
My mic. Okay, thank you, Your Worship. I think this makes a lot of sense because just fundamentally, we are an elected body and we're exercising the elements of democracy. And if we take the subject matter that Housing and Homelessness Liaison has, and I think we have to have that subject matter ultimately be brought up and debated in a democratic open forum where the public can come and comment, as opposed to having a liaison go off on his or her own and come up with a direction or a recommended direction. We saw in the last term that the committee went one way and the liaison went a different direction in their reports, and the incongruity there is one issue, but I think the central issue is that it has to come back to the democratically elected body debating it in the open, and by having the liaison be a member of the committee, it makes that something that is going to happen.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Eglai.
Question, I'm not sure who will answer it, but is the intention that the liaison would also be the chair, or would be a standalone member from the chair?
Standalone.
Standalone?
Could be anybody, could be the chair, could be standalone.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so on the motion by Councillor Deans, carried. On the matter before us as amended, carried. Item 2, the establishment of council sponsors group to work with staff on the development of the respective mandates for the council liaisons and sport commissioners described in this report. Carried. Item 3, the establishment of 3 deputy mayor positions for 2018-2022, and that the appointments for these positions be recommended to council by mayor and include it in the nominating committee report. Carried. Item 4, the temporary FTE be provided to support the role of the DMs to be funded from the Council Administrative Services budget as described in this report, page 150, 151. Carried. Item 5, that the Council receive the information related to options for a Women's Bureau outlined in this report, pages 152 to 162. Carried. Item 6, that the Council approve the establishment of a Council sponsors group to work with staff on the development of a City of Ottawa gender equity strategy and/or Women's Bureau, and an additional full-time equivalent be incorporated into the draft 2019 operating budget. Be incorporated in the draft 2019 operating budget in the Partner and Stakeholder Initiatives Branch, the Community and Social Services Department, along with any additional funds required to support the first phase of this work as described in the report. And Councillor Deans has a motion, seconded by Councillor McKenney. Councillor Deans.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This is really just for clarification's sake. I believe it was fully the intention of the authors of the report, but I just want to make it 100% clear. So I'm just adding the language back into the therefore be it resolved. So it will say that Council approved the establishment of a Council sponsors group to work with staff on the development of a City of Ottawa gender equity strategy and/or a Women's Bureau. And then I'm specifically inserting this sentence, including developing a consultation process for setting priorities and a measurable outcome-based framework which takes a holistic, intersectional approach to policy, program, and practice review, coupled with robust data collection and reporting as described in this report. And then the rest is just the same, and that an additional full-time FTE be incorporated into the draft 2019 operating budget in the Partner and Stakeholder Initiatives Branch, the Community and Social Services Department, along with any additional funds required to support the first phase of this work as described in this report. I think it's clear that most municipalities, from the report, the way it's written, most municipalities are doing exactly these things as the first steps, and they're outlined there. I just want to make it very clear that we too will be doing that.
So on Councillor Dean's amendment, carried. On the report as amended, carried. Update on ward boundary review, conservation authorities, and municipal parking management strategy. No associated recommendations, pages 162 to 169. Councillor Fleury has a motion, seconded by Councillor McKenney, with respect to parking.
Merci, Monsieur le Maire.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Back to our work, our Transportation Committee work last term. There was an objective to review the municipal parking management strategy. It's been delayed and has dragged on. Obviously will carry through in this term. I'm just prescribing one component of that review, which is the parking authority, so that staff come back to Transportation Committee by Q2 of 2019. So it just prescribes when we want that section of that report. That's all I'm asking. It carried through committee in terms of priority. It was just never achieved last term.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Eglai.
I have a question for staff. So it's my understanding that staff already is engaged in this process, has set out a timeline, which has been provided to Councillor Fleury and the rest of previous council.
Your microphone, Councillor.
Sorry? That's good. Oh, if you can confirm that, and also if you can confirm if there are resources, both financial and staff, to speed it up as Councillor Fleury is asking, or whether that would put a pressure on both staff and finances that you can't deal with right now.
Mr. Mayor, that's correct. We do have a work plan, we have a timeline, and as per my memo sent out in October, we're gearing for the fall of 2019. We've refined that to October 2019. We'll try and aim for September 2019. And that's in order to do a full consultation on the complete strategy, which includes 3 components. One's the strategy refresh, which is reviewing the current first principle of service over revenue generation. And it also, gives the rate setting guidelines. The second component of that is the governance structure, which will include the consideration of a parking authority. And the third component of that is the new bike parking strategy that we want to bring forward. It is a complex program, and we feel the timelines are required to bring all components to council so that they can have a fulsome view of the strategy. If the motion passes, we'd have to regroup with staff. My sense is that some of that would fall off, probably the bike parking strategy and likely other components of the strategy.
Okay, Councillor Harder.
My question's on the nominating committee before you pass the whole section, please.
Okay. Anyone else on this? Councillor Brockington had a question on the ward boundary review. No, you go ahead and we'll do it all. Okay. Well, anyways, Councillor Brockington and then Councillor Harder on ward boundary, and then we'll deal with the motion.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just a question for the city clerk and solicitor on page 163, 164. It just talks about the pending City of Ottawa ward boundary review. Just some concerns in my community. There's some wording here that I just want clarified. It says, as part of the forthcoming report, the ward boundary report, staff will also review matters relating to ward boundary reviews that arose recently in the City of Toronto. I certainly applaud the attempts to look at best practices, lessons learned to make sure our process is smooth, but the concerns are about the next wording, specifically Bill 5, the Better Local Government Act 2018. That, in essence, took former City of Toronto wards and aligned them with federal and provincial boundaries. Is that on the radar screen, or what is that? Why is the reference to Bill 5 in the report?
Mr. Mayor, the reference to Bill 5 in there is to assure that members, as we go forward with the ward boundary review, will appreciate that constitutionally speaking, the province of Ontario is supreme with regards to all municipalities. So as Toronto experienced, they went through, I believe, a 3-year ward boundary review with external consultants, multiple sessions of consultation. I believe it was fairly expensive. And at the end of the day, the province of Ontario passed legislation to provide the number that they want and, quite frankly, the boundaries. So what I'm doing with this regard is to, and I've had this discussion with various members offline, we want to be cognizant of the jurisdiction that the province of Ontario has, and as we go into this process, we would go into it wide open.
Very well. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Thank you. On the same subject, Councillor Harder, please.
Yeah. we know that, well, I know that we're not on the high on the radar when it comes to our ward boundary review with the province in any way. But I did want to raise a question. It says we're going to complete this in 2019. Doesn't it say that? It says required to be undertaken in 2019. Do you anticipate it'll be finished in a year? Mr. Martin.
So, Mr. Mayor, it is anticipated that certainly the process at the city would be finished within a year. If there are appeals, that might take us into 2020.
Sure, and for those that haven't been part of this process before, it's important that you know that we have to have it in the bag, all completed by December 31st, 2021, in order for the change to be made. And since I represent 60,000 plus people with a forecast of over 70,000 by the end of this term, it's absolutely important that we get this done. So I look forward to the process, and I'm hoping, are you going to be giving us a draft or starting it in the first quarter of 2019, and are you going to put together a sponsors group?
We'll be starting in Q1 of 2019. I wasn't going to put together a sponsors group, but we will be bringing the report, and I will be talking to members of council throughout the process.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Blais.
Just a quick process question. Which committee would have oversight of the ward boundary review?
Mr. Mayor, that would be FEDCO. It is routinely gone there.
Okay, so we have Councillor Fleury's motion. Well, I think there's support for it, so carried. Dissent by Councillors Tierney and Eglai. And then I'm Shirley. And the other items on boundary review and so on is received. Item number 7, report recommendations. The city clerk and solicitor be delegated the authority to implement changes to all related processes, procedures, policies, terms of reference, and to bring forward bylaws as required to implement council's decisions further to the approval of this report and to reflect the current organizational alignment. Councillor El Shantiri.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a question to the clerk. As you prepare for the term of reference or committee term of reference, can we have some input at some point where we can add some concern about natural disaster and have some focus on emergency management as a part of term of reference for a committee?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, and the councillor has raised this with me, and as has the GM, quite frankly, that we want to make sure that this is brought to the fore and highlighted in the next round.
Okay. I just want to be on the record, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
Appreciate that. Thank you, Councillor. On item 7, carried. Next is motion to strike the nominating committee. I have a motion moved by myself, seconded by Councillor Tierney, whereas pursuant to subsection 94(2) of the procedure bylaw, the first meeting of the nominating committee has been scheduled for 9:30 a.m. Tuesday, December 11th, with its report rising for consideration at the City Council meeting on Wednesday, December 12th, 2018. Therefore, be it resolved that Council approve the appointment of 8 members of Council to serve on the nominating committee, in addition to the Mayor as Chair, to make recommendations to Council on appointments of members of Council to standing committees, subcommittees, boards, and the selection panels, and other appointments as set out in the governance report. Be it further resolved that the members of the nominating committee be Councillors Moffat, El Shantiri, Blais, Dudas, Suds, Harder, Kavanaugh, and myself. On the report? Carried. So on the, first of all, I think a big thanks to our staff. This takes a lot of time. I know a number of members of the clerk's office work burning the midnight oil, and I'd like to thank Mr. Clerk and his staff for a job well done. Bravo, congratulations. I know it's not easy getting all of the feedback in, but you did a very good job. So on the report as amended, carried. Next item is General Manager, Emergency and Protective Services report on Ontario cannabis legislation, cannabis retail stores, and response to Council direction of August 29th. Today, colleagues, staff are tabling the report on Ontario's cannabis legislation, cannabis retail stores, and responses to Council direction of August 29, 2018. Our General Manager of Emergency and Protective Services, Anthony DeMonte, is here to provide us with a high-level overview of the report to help inform our discussion on December 13th at our Special Committee of the Whole. As you know, the various levels of government have been preparing for the legalization of recreational cannabis simultaneously. Much of the responsibilities for the management and regulation of recreational cannabis rests with the federal and provincial governments. However, at issue for us in this debate is whether or not to allow private retail cannabis stores in Ottawa and what specifically we need to keep discussing with upper levels of government. A lot of work, public consultation and analysis has happened since August 29th to make sure we have the information we need to make this important decision. For example, staff have reviewed all the applicable legislation, reached out to the provincial government, AMO, and the City of Toronto to identify opportunities for a common approach, consulted internally with the Ottawa Police, Ottawa Public Health, and Economic Development staff, conducted public polling through ECOS on residents' views on cannabis retail stores, held public consultations through a survey that generated almost 24,000 responses, and analyzed the implications of both opting out and allowing retail stores. All of this is summarized in the report that has just been handed to you and that Council will be considering on December 13th. It includes information on the regulatory framework for cannabis retail stores and summary of staff's analysis and staff's recommendation. I'd like to remind Council and members of the public that public delegations can be heard in Committee of the Whole on December 13th here in the Council chamber. Today is only for high-level questions. This is important for my colleagues to understand. We're simply tabling, and only questions that are very much high level based on process or procedure will be allowed. We'll debate and ask your detailed questions to the staff on December 13th, or I'd also encourage members of Council before that to meet one-on-one with perhaps the Chief or our legal staff or public health. And I would remind members that the Police Chief, Chief Bordelot, and Dr. Etches, our Medical Officer of Health, will be in attendance December 13th to respond to any questions with respect to the professional input that they have provided in this report tabled today. So following the presentation today, Council will table the report for consideration on the 13th. And now over to you, Mr. DeMonte.
Thank you, Mayor. Good afternoon, members of Council. Today I'm joined by my colleague Valerie Bietlo, the manager of the Public Policy Development Branch in my department. Bonjour, Monsieur le Maire, Mesdames, Messieurs, les membres du Conseil.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor, members of Council. I am with my colleague Yves Bédreau, who's the manager of policy development in my department.
Be before Council for consideration at the special meeting on Thursday, December 13th, and public delegations, as you've indicated, Mayor, will also have the opportunity to provide comments to you on the report at that time. This report specifically addresses the province of Ontario's private retail regime for recreational cannabis, as well as Council's direction to staff received this past August. The decision before Council is whether to opt out from having private retail cannabis stores in the City of Ottawa prior to the province's January 22nd deadline. In the report, you will see that staff are recommending to allow private cannabis retail stores to operate in Ottawa beginning April 1st, 2019. You will find the information supporting staff recommendation, including an analysis of the implications of opting out, which include crime-related consequences, economic development opportunities, the proximity of other jurisdictions, public health considerations, and access to additional provincial funding. The report also responds to Council's direction to staff to provide information on key provisions of both the federal and provincial government's framework, as well as the work that City staff has completed to prepare the cannabis legalization, both externally in terms of outreach we've done with AMO, the Government of Ontario, the City of Toronto, and with our partners in Ottawa Public Health and the Ottawa Police Service, and internally to respond to the requests from the public to ensure that all city departments and municipal partners were ready to respond. Finally, the report also includes the results of the public opinion research and online survey. Since October 17th, access to recreational cannabis is legal in Canada. Federal law effectively creates specific baseline rules for how it can be legally grown, produced, sold, and purchased. Access to medical cannabis continues to be separately regulated by the federal government under pre-existing rules. Each province can make its own specific rules to supplement the baseline federal rules. Combined, both levels of government create a highly regulated environment for recreational cannabis, from its production all the way to its sales. In Ontario, the legal age is 19 to buy, possess, and the limit is 30 grams. And the province solely regulates the sale of recreational cannabis. Residents can now legally purchase cannabis online only through the provincial Ontario Cannabis Store. Starting next April, provincially licensed and regulated cannabis retail stores will operate in municipalities that do not opt out. Staff's assessment of the regulatory regime for retail cannabis stores suggests that it will be highly regulated in accordance with federal rules, and the objective is to prevent youth access, but also to allow legally produced cannabis to of-age consumers and prevent illegal dispensaries and illicit producers and sellers from participating in the legal recreational cannabis market. Timelines leading up to this legislation have been extremely compressed. In August 2018, the newly elected provincial government announced the retail model would be entirely regulated, licensed, and enforced by the Alcohol Gaming Commission of Ontario, AGCO for short. The retail model also includes an unlimited number of private retail stores and provision where municipalities could choose to opt out from the retail cannabis regime. From that announcement came Council's direction to staff to review the new regime and explore options and consequences of opting out. The province of Ontario's cannabis legislation was enacted October 17th, the same day that recreational cannabis became legal in Canada, and the regulations to support the private retail regime was later passed on November 14th. The AGCO continues as we speak to develop and disclose details of the regulatory regime as they prepare for readiness, including the application process for potential stores and the AGCO's own standards that will be imposed on store operators. City departments and partners have been actively involved in preparing and responding to the legalization of recreational cannabis. Both the Integrated Cannabis Legalization Steering Committee and the operational team, which includes Ottawa Police and Ottawa Public Health, were established to, first, ensure the readiness to respond to the cannabis-related calls for service. Secondly, to develop a comprehensive landing page on ottawa.ca to help inform residents. Third, to ensure that all 311 calls could be triaged and handled effectively. And finally, to review and update the city's internal policies related to cannabis. In addition, I've had the pleasure of representing the city in discussions with AMO and other partners, such as the City of Toronto, to review the cannabis legislation from the province as it emerged. I've been the city's member of the AMO reference group on cannabis legislation since its establishment in the spring of 2018. And as part of this group, I've participated in discussions with the Office of the Attorney General, staff from both the Ministry of Finance and AGSCO, and have provided feedback related to the legal powers for municipalities and planning considerations in collaboration with AMO. Additionally, Mayor Watson has supported this ongoing work by writing to the Minister of Finance, the Attorney General of Ontario, and the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing to specifically discuss municipal powers regarding the Cannabis Retail Act. The province of Ontario has created a cannabis retail model that will establish a private retail stores as of April 1st in municipalities that allow them. As noted earlier, municipalities have until January 22nd to decide whether they wish to opt out of this model. Under the province's regulatory regime, and as earlier stated by our city solicitor, the provincial constitutional powers, there is no legal authority for municipalities to regulate the stores, and municipalities are prohibited from licensing or putting specific zoning in place for cannabis retail stores. As a result, the AGCO will decide who can operate cannabis retail stores and where they will be located. Provincial legislation, in addition to the AGCO standards, will dictate how these stores operate. The legislation provides that the AGCO must reject applications that are not in the public interest, which has been defined under the regulation as meaning protecting public health and safety, protecting youth and restricting access to cannabis, and preventing illicit activities in relation to cannabis. Further, the AGCO receives an application and municipalities will have 15 days to provide comment. The report recommends that the General Manager of Planning, Infrastructure and Economic Development be given delegated authority to submit a response on behalf of the City of Ottawa with the concurrence of the Ward Councillor, based on key principles that are outlined in the report, which will include prevention of clustering, separation distances from sensitive sites, allowing stores in zones where retail use is the principal use, as well as local issues pertaining to protecting public health and safety, protecting youth, and restricting their access to cannabis and preventing illicit activities. Municipalities in Ontario have a one-time option to opt out of this provincially regulated retail model. If a municipality chooses to opt out, it can only reverse this decision once, and it must provide notification to the AGCO registrar by January 22nd, 2019. If a municipality decides not to opt out, they have by default chosen to allow private stores to operate, and there's no reversing this decision. The Ontario Ministry of Finance has confirmed a $40 million envelope for municipalities during the first 2 years to support enforcement and other implementation-related costs. The funding will be distributed as follows. The province will distribute the first payment of $15 million, which will be paid to all municipalities on a per-household basis. This amounts for Ottawa to just over $1 million. The province will then distribute a second payment of $15 million after January 22nd to all municipalities on a per-household basis that have opted in. Again, this would amount to at least $1 million for the City of Ottawa, but may be higher depending on the proportion of municipalities that decide to opt out across Ontario. If a municipality decides to opt out in the second round, the payment will only be $5,000. The province is also setting aside $10 million of municipal funding to address costs that are unforeseen, and the priority will be given to those municipalities that have not opted out. In addition, the province of Ontario portion of the revenue from recreational cannabis, if it exceeds $100 million in the first 2 years of legalization, the province will provide 50% of the surplus to be divided amongst the municipalities that have opted in. Therefore, based on staff's recommendation to allow private retail of cannabis stores, it is estimated the City of Ottawa will receive over $2 million at a minimum, as well as access to other potential provincial funding to offset costs. As a result, and directed by City staff, we undertook analysis to collect public input on cannabis retail stores. 2 methods of collecting input were chosen. ECOS Research Associates were retained to conduct public opinion research by randomized telephone surveys to provide citywide measurement of public opinion on cannabis retail stores. The ECOS public opinion research revealed that 48% supported having cannabis retail stores and 43% were opposed. However, these numbers are more polarized depending on whether the respondents supported the legalization of recreational cannabis. Among the supporters of legalized cannabis, 78% were in favor, whereas only 10% were in favor that opposed legalization. Also worthy of note, 88% of those who will purchase would prefer to buy in a store as opposed to online. The second method of collecting input was through the online public survey at ottawa.ca. The online survey received more than 23,800 responses, and close to 16,000 of those were from the Ottawa area. The online survey favored having cannabis retail stores in Ottawa, as 78% were in favor, and 87% of those who purchased would prefer to buy from a store. These public input opportunities are further detailed in the report. In conclusion, staff is recommending that the City of Ottawa Council agree to have private retail stores in Ottawa based on the 5 following key areas. First, the anticipated negative consequences of allowing the illicit cannabis market to flourish and controlling access to minors. If there is no legal retail option, organized crime and illegal sellers will continue to fill that void. Secondly, the potential economic development opportunities and proximity to other jurisdictions and impacts having private retail cannabis stores in Ottawa. Third, the public health advantages of having private retail cannabis stores, namely those related to the quality of the product and the education and support that can be provided at the point of sale in a retail store model. Fourth, the public input received in favor of having cannabis retail stores, and in particular, input provided by cannabis consumers in Ottawa who would prefer to shop in retail stores. And finally, the financial advantages to help offset legalization and implementation costs by having access to additional provincial funding excuse me, from allowing cannabis retail stores. In summary, staff have provided a great deal of information, and you received a report of over 150 pages this morning to consider over the next week. We will be reaching out to members of council over the course of the next few days to meet, if required, and answer any questions you may have with respect to the contents. As the Mayor indicated, our colleagues, the Chief of Police and the Medical Officer of Health, and their staff will also be available should you require, and will be present at the December 13th meeting to answer questions as well. Again, this report will be before you at the next special meeting on December 13th for considerations. Ce rapport sera soumis à l'examen du Conseil lors de la réunion spéciale.
This sub-report will be examined at the special plenary meeting on December 13th, when the public will also have an opportunity to express comments. Thank you for your attention.
On behalf of Council, Mr. Demonte, he's worked very hard on this report, and he has also been very much a key member of the task force at the province-wide level working with AMO. So he's very well versed on the issues. Just to remind members, these have to be at a, I hate using the word high level in this debate, but a broad perspective on procedure. So please don't get into the weeds. It's just been tabled. The whole purpose of tabling is bring it back and come back with your questions. All right, Councillor Fleury.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll be very quick. Can we get the AGCO and Ottawa Public Health to attend the meeting where we will be reviewing this matter?
Well, Public Health is agreed. Dr. Etches is coming.
Mayor, Public Health has agreed. We can reach out to the AGCO and we'll follow up with you directly, Councillor.
Perfect. And then my second question, and it's the last one here, relates to you're presenting an opt-in, opt-out, but you're not presenting what I believe to be a third option. And my question is at a high level to the clerk. It really relates to, Mr. Clerk, under the guidelines of the province relating to this matter, what happens if council were to choose not to vote on opting in or opting out?
Then you are in.
Right. Okay, thank you. Councillor Blais on procedure. Councillor Blais. Oh.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I guess it would be helpful if before now and our individual briefings.
Sorry, we can't hear you, Councillor.
It would be helpful if before now and the individual briefings that Mr. Demonte offered, or the debate on the 19th or whenever it is, could in the common drive you put relevant supporting documentation that might be available from AMO or AGCO or whomever else may have weighed in on these issues over the last number of months while it's been in the public debate?
Mayor, absolutely. We'll, all the documentation from AMO, some of the presentations they did to the province, we'll make that available and we'll do that.
Right. That's a very good procedural question. Thank you. Councillor Elshantiri.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Mr. Demonte. Mr. Demonte, on the working group at AMO, was other than municipal staffing, was the Ontario Chief of Police or the Ontario Medical Office, were they on a work group?
Mayor, the targeted group was limited. The province asked AMO to put the group together, so it was a diverse representation of municipalities. Obviously, the City of Toronto, which is independent. Ottawa sat there. They had regional level governments. They had small cities. They had single tier and smaller municipalities. They met the province, the Ministry of Finance, and the Attorney General's office met separately with the chiefs of police and with the public health group as well too. And that input, however, was available to us during our multiple meetings, full-day meetings at Queen's Park in Toronto and through several of our teleconferences. So their input weren't with us directly, but they had met with them separately, and everything that those groups had to say were also part of the debate.
And my other question for clarification is, and maybe I heard you right, say, if we're not in, then you cannot, well, first of all, you don't receive the funding, and B, you cannot shut down those illegal stores. Is that?
Two questions there, Mr. Mayor. As the city solicitor indicated and clerk indicated to us, the wording is a little bizarre. The option you have is to opt out. If you don't use that option, you're automatically in. So there's not really an opt-in option. Your second part of the question is with regards to the illegal dispensaries. That is clearly a police matter. The new Cannabis Act does give police services significantly more powers than they had previously to shut those illegal dispensaries down, including more stringent fines and other elements. As well now, the owner of a building that allows an illegal operation can also be charged, and there's significant fines. So that's a big incentive, and those tools have begun to be used by different police forces across the province, which meets one of the key objectives that the province has in this, is to remove all the illegal dispensaries and take illicit crime and organized crime out of the equation.
And final question, are you going to bring us how many municipality over 50,000 is going to be out or in by the 13th? Would you be able to share that information?
Yeah, Mayor, the challenge with that is because of the different, we've all gone through municipal elections, because of the different timing when different councils are beginning to look at this, varies across the province. I don't believe we'll have a clear understanding how many municipalities are using which option, unfortunately, by that then. But we'll attempt to get whatever list we have, we'll bring, but it will not be exhaustive, and I don't know how helpful it'll be for you in your debate, but we'll bring you what we have.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Dumont.
Thank you. Councillor Aguilar on procedure.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Two very quick questions. First of all, the slideshow that you've just given us, quite helpful. Will that be made available to us so we can share through our social media channels to our residents in advance of the special meeting?
Yes, Mayor, we'll do that. And I apologize. I noticed when it was up there how small the font was there. Certainly, without my glasses, I wouldn't be able to read it. But the answer is yes.
Okay. And the second question, I think the Mayor will stop me if I'm going too far, but you spoke about public health is going to be at the meeting. And you also spoke in your presentation that one of the advantages is public health will be involved. Is there a formal commitment from the province that public health will be working with the independent shop owners? Is that in place or not in place? And will we have more information about that at the special meeting?
Mayor, I don't want to get into too much detail. We can discuss it more in detail at the meeting, but in essence, the province is responsible on the on-site. They are completely responsible, and they have assumed the responsibility to do public health messaging when products are being sold in those retail stores. That completely belongs to them. Public health, the medical officer of health will be present because they were extremely important in the preparation of this report with their professional expertise, as well as the police service, and the chief helped us enormously with regards to the organized crime component. So they'll both be present. You can ask those questions both to our medical officer of health and our police chief. And I hope that answers your question.
I would encourage also members to contact Dr. Etches as well in between.
Sure.
Because I'm sure
it was more about the funding piece, like whether the province is going to pay for this or whether we're going to pay for the public health component.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Gower, please.
Thank you, Mr. DeMonte. You alluded to the short timelines, and we all know that the release of legislation and policy details has been a evolving process over the past few months. Do you anticipate between now and the special meeting next week, is there any additional information that we as a city have asked for that we haven't received yet, or is there any new information that comes up that isn't contained in this report?
Mayor, from a policy perspective and decision-making for elected officials, I think the fundamentals are there. So the concept of law is there from the provincial government. The only element that's still in development, and I alluded in my presentation, the AGCO is still working on their component. So if you apply to run, be an operator, some of the details of what their expectations of you for the stores and the details of the installation inside the stores, other than what's provided already in federal and provincial law, that's still being worked on. But in essence, I think both from a federal perspective, and we'll get more in detail at the presentation, the meeting, and the provincial perspective, you have pretty much everything that's available to you for a policy decision.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Councillor Gower. Councillor Meehan, please.
My question is, I understand under the current legislative framework that the Alcohol and Gaming Commission has control over location, number, and the province is setting out the revenue stream. Has there been any consultation with the city, with the province rather, to negotiate that we have more control, that we can have better say in the location and numbers of the retail outlets? And can we negotiate a better deal than $1 million with the province on the revenue portion of the legislation?
Yeah, Councillor, as Mr. DeMonte mentioned, I've spoken now to 4 ministers, written a letter, and they have not budged from their position. So their position is what Mr. DeMonte pointed out, but I did try on the issue of distance, zoning, proximity to high schools, and so on.
Can we implement bylaw amendments under that?
No, we can't supersede provincial authority. Okay, Councillor Cloutier, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Maire.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Your Worship. Next week on the meeting of the plenary committee on the 13th, can we have information from the Ottawa Police Services regarding estimated costs? The estimated cost of Mr. Cloutier, this is a kind of detail that we'll be asking about then. I understand. I just want to be sure that the people I can ask that question of will be here on the 13th. Your Worship, we will ensure that we are in a position to answer the questions by the councillor.
Thank you, Your Worship. At the very beginning of the debate on the Salvation Army Multi-Use Center, the city clerk read a statement about what items of discussion were in scope and what items of discussion were out of scope. I think it would be useful as we start to think about and we get into this document and think about the types of discussion points and debate that we want, that the city clerk remind members of council what is in scope for debate and discussion. There are certain things that maybe we want to get into that we just aren't authorized or permitted to do so. So I'm just suggesting it would be useful, to me at least, if the city clerk could send a brief one-pager about what items are in scope for us to debate and discuss next week and what authority we don't have it as under provincial legislation. So can I give that direction?
Mr. Clerk?
Yes,
I think
Mr.
that's
Mayor,
a good point. It's also, I think, maybe what I can do at the beginning of the meeting, because we'll have public delegations after the presentation, is to remind members of the public as well. You know, the debate over whether it's legalized or not is over. We don't have any authority on that. We've got to move forward. Yeah. Thank you. Councillor Menard, please.
Thanks very much, Mr. Mayor. Just one quick question around the actual locations of these. I've been receiving inquiries quite frequently for areas in my ward where people would like to open a dispensary or what have you. Is there any chance that we get a report on that day next week that will say, here's the inquiries we've had so far? I'm sure you've had many of them.
Mayor, as indicated, that responsibility is purely with the AGCO. Those requests go to them. They will make all those decisions. And we'll have that debate. We've proposed something in one of the recommendations that gives my colleague Steve Willis and the ward councillor an opportunity to at least let known our position. Again, the authority is not with us. They can receive and take our advice or move on. But we'll get more into that debate, and we can answer that more clearly on the 13th.
Yeah, no, I understand that it's with the AGCO. I'm wondering if there's a list of some sort that they've already compiled of inquiries they've received of where they might be in our wards. There's going to be several that open up if this passes, and so any list that they may have in advance, it'd be helpful to know if they had that, or if you've received inquiries. I think it'd be good for council.
Mayor, the discussion we've had with the AGCOs until until the date, they're just receiving and compiling. They're not processing any of those requests until you've made your decision as whether you're opting in or out, and then maybe then we will be able to receive, or we will through a process that will be established with the city. So unfortunately, I don't believe we'll have any inkling of that for the 13th.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Councillor Menard. Councillor Kavanaugh, please.
Thank you very much. It's already been pointed out that we have very little control over the zoning, that the province has stated what they want, and it's very difficult to go from there. But one of the other questions I have is in regards to private property and bylaws. This has already been coming up in the election in terms of, you know, my neighbor smoking, it's bothering me, that kind of stuff. Where does that fit in to what we can control?
And that's a very good question, I think, at the next meeting, Committee of the Whole, because I'm just dealing with process now, but that's something that
Well, I want to know
well.
when it fits in terms of the process of...
Yeah, no, it would come up at our meeting on December 13th, and we'll have the public health officials here for that, who have carriage of the Smoke-Free Ontario Act. Councillor Dudas, please.
Just a point of clarification. So I noticed that the survey received more than 23,000 responses, and I just wanted to understand how that compares to other city-run surveys.
Mayor, just on that, for certainly emergency protective services, and we last year had a big debate, a policy debate on Uber. This is significant. We've never seen that many responses, so it very much is a large response to a public issue. So there was obviously a lot of interest. It's the largest we've seen.
Anyone else on process? So let me just read out that at its meeting of December 5th, City Council received and tabled the report on Ontario cannabis legislation, cannabis retail stores, and response to Council direction on August 29, 2018 for consideration at the December 13th special meeting of Council called for that purpose, and which will include receiving public delegations. So received. And just the clerk has asked me to clarify the composition of the nominating committee is a total of 8, including me, not in addition to me. Motion to adopt reports, Councillors Blais and Nussbaum, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, that the report from the City Clerk and Solicitor entitled 2018-2022 Council Governance Review be received and adopted as amended.
Carried. Motions requiring suspension of the rules. We have 2. Councillor Moffat, seconded by, oh, I'm sorry, there notice is a motion. Sorry, does anyone have a motion requiring suspension of the rules of procedure? No. Notice is a motion. Councillor Moffat, signed by Councillor Derouz, if you'd like to introduce it. I'll second it because Councillor Derouz had a medical appointment.
You're right. It's just me moving slush money. I mean, it's a special fund. It's a trust fund that's set up specifically for the Centennial Park in Mantic, and we're just moving some money around to be able to work on a concept plan. So I'll bring that forward in a week's time.
Okay, we'll deal with that at the next meeting. Next is Councillor Fleury, signed by Councillor Nussbaum. Notice of motion on MacArthur Avenue bike lanes.
Mr. Mayor, sorry, the clerk's just sent me a revised version here, so I'll read you that one. Whereas the MacArthur Avenue Improvement Plan was recently completed and provides much-needed bike lanes that are used by residents in all seasons through the year, whereas failure to clear the MacArthur Avenue bike lane would result in accessibility challenges for OC Transport users and other residents, whereas the reduction from 4 to 2 vehicular lanes as part of the MacArthur Avenue Improvement Plan has resulted in a reduced cost for road plowing, whereas $37,000 is required to maintain the MacArthur Avenue bike lane to council-approved maintenance quality standards for the remainder of the current budget year, and whereas the city treasurer has advised that the tax rate stabilization reserve is potentially funding source for the continued maintenance of the MacArthur Avenue bike lane for the remainder of the current year. Therefore, be it resolved that council approve funding for the tax stabilization reserve fund to maintain the MacArthur Avenue bike lanes to council approved maintenance quality standards for the remainder of the current budget year.
Okay, that's a notice of motion. Any other notice of motion for consideration at our next meeting? Confirmation bylaw, Councillor Blais, please.
Que le règlement suivant soit lu et adopté, règlement ratifiant les délibérations du Conseil du 5 décembre 2018.
Adopté, carried. Madam Deputy Clerk, any written inquiries? Adjournment, Councillor Blais, please.
Que les délibérations
Adjournment, that the proceedings of the City Council meeting of December 5th, 2018 be adjourned. Motion adoptée.
Still as excited as they were on swearing-in night.